Hello, I'm Rob Walker. I was the head writer for this movie. Also did some effects, some of the post-digital lighting effects, a little bit of color correction, line producer, and snake handler. Yeah, most people don't realize that Bennett the Sage is actually a boa constrictor. Um, so he requires a lot of handling. Pretty difficult, but anyway, yeah. So starting off, we've got Bargo and Doug. Not really reprising their role. We just ran stock footage. Knew from the beginning that we kind of wanted to do Star Trek 3. It just made sense to me. I mean, I wrote it exactly like Star Trek 3 to open because we closed with spoofing Star Trek 2. So, and we color corrected it, made it look like the Star Trek 2 opening with the blue tinge, and I think it worked just because it was goofy enough doing Star Trek 2 at the end of the other one, and it's even goofier, I think, seeing it now with all of the drama even played up more. Like, this was such an important scene that you had to remember. Um, but it served a dual purpose because we needed to kind of recap just what the hell happened last time because this was actually a continuation. This is not a self-contained movie. I did my best to write it in some ways so that it could be sort of self-contained, and I did that kind of by like doing recaps and stuff, or some plot exposition. But this definitely is part of Suburban Nights, unlike Suburban Nights, which was not a part of Kickassia. It had nothing to do with Kickassia. You can watch that without having to see Kickassia. This is one of Jim Trokin's effects based off of what he did for the DVD in our director's cut ending. Actually, it was more writer's cut. I wanted the ending to be that because I knew we were going to go this route. So I was like, let's make it connect as a film and its sequel. Um, Interesting thing, this was actually the last thing I did on the movie was fix the credits. Um, the initial credits Doug had didn't look right. I couldn't figure out why, but they looked very much like a TV movie or like a VCR program and stuff. Like, so I came up with these credits, added a lens flare, and also gave a lens flare to the plot hole to try to give it a little more weight and a sense of three dimensionality. Because Jim actually did a great job on the plot hole, but it's still an effect. And then at the end, Jim can do a great job making the plot hole itself, but just inserting it in there is kind of difficult. It sometimes lacks that three-dimensional quality. So chances I had to kind of just, add a small effect or two to fix it, I would try to do that. Um, I love these opening credits. These are actually way better than I thought they were going to be. I was kind of spooked wondering how we were going to do this. And Doug's like, oh, I have an idea. And I was like, well, that sounds great. I don't know how you're going to do it, though. But, you know, definitely found a way. Doug basically sent this out. I don't know if it was to Merobot. Doug handled that one, so you have to ask. You have to check out his commentary, but he should definitely tell you. But I think they're spectacular. Love Sketch's theme. It's an absolutely brilliant theme. My only issue with it is actually that we totally sold Sketch short because we couldn't provide him with any real resources. Like, I would have killed to hear this with a real orchestra and real musicians. Rob Walker, who the hell is that? Hack. But so there is sort of a quality of one of these things is not like the other when it comes to the music because the classical stuff and the pro score stuff definitely has weight to it. And poor Sketch just all he has is whatever equipment's in his room or his office. So we ever get tons of money, like special edition this stuff and hand it to an orchestra and Sketch will get the, big moment he deserves. But until then, it's perfectly serviceable. I always felt bad. And there was some talk about whether we wanted to, even drop it or not, but that we just felt that is so not fair to Sketch. Because he did do such a great work on it. And it's a great theme. It's just the lack of resources, and that's totally our fault, so. Yeah, based on it. Okay, so interesting thing. I don't know how Doug got top writing credit. He gave me based on a concept, which I told him was unnecessary. But then when I saw the credits, and it's my fault because he told me to double check the credits, and I didn't correct him. But I was like, I wrote the script beginning to end. How did you get top writing credit for this? Like, I was kind of like, I went back to him and he's just like, whoa, you got the based on a concept by, and I was like, that's a bullshit Hollywood credit. Nobody pays attention to that credit. He's like, well, whatever. So, but, now I should say, um, this was a later addition to the script. Trying to think where I want to go with this first. First, Paul and I shot this on the final day of shooting while they were doing the party scenes. Doug was starting the party scenes in his basement, and I grabbed Paul, went a short distance away, and shot this. That's a great Phelan effect. I actually convinced my parents, who were just like, "Where did you shoot this? Where's that satellite dish?" And I was like, "It's not there." My mom was like, "Oh, that's amazing." So, but yeah, I took like 5 minutes to storyboard this, drove him out there. We just banged through this, even though it was a little difficult because people kept walking in the background, people walking their dogs and stuff, but it's Holly's car. It was it went really smoothly. The only thing I think that was a quick little hang up was Paul didn't actually know how to act this. I'm not sure if he had seen Contact. So I love how Doug has no shame. I would never be caught dead with a comforter like that or in a room with Ronald McDonald colors, but when we moved into that house, we were living together for about a year, renting this place, and Doug's still there. That was the kids' room, and they never repainted it. The original owners basically left it like that with the curtains. Doug never changed it, so I don't know how his retinas haven't burnt out, but... So, yeah, the only hang-up was Paul was asking how to do this, because he kind of was just darting around in every direction. I had to give him the direction of, like, no, imagine that you've been waiting to hear this sound all of your life, that this would give your life actual final meaning, and imagine for an instant, just an instant, you hear something. It's a little something in the background, and you listen closer and closer, and you realize it's getting louder, and you realize this is it. Finally, after all this time, this is it. And he got it on the first take after I gave him that description. Like, Paul actually can really act, which is why I always feel bad that we underuse him, but part of that has to do more with his character than anything. Interesting, original draft of the script, these scenes were not there, the Contact scene and this scene. These were later additions by Doug. In the first scene, Doug originally talked to Linkara, and it came after the plot exposition in the halls of Congress. Now, the interesting thing is, this is a good scene. Each of us had a different approach, and there's a pro and con to each. My biggest concern was, let's get exposition going fast and open with a bang. That's something Nicholas Myers always said when he was talking about Star Trek 6, is always open with a bang. And so I wanted, plot hole exploding, opening credits, cut to the exposition scene. Give us all the information you need to know. And it was a spoof of Star Trek 4, which is one of the best exposition scenes I've ever seen because it wrapped up 3 movies worth of plot in one quick sort of run-through. And also gave you all the drama, told you everything the movie was going to be about. So I really wanted to just get that going. And it's a louder scene. There's people in the background yelling. It's a courtroom scene. Turl is angry, and I thought, this is it. Let's really do this. Doug, on the other hand, wanted to do this, which is good in some ways for drama. The issue that I had was the pacing just grounds to a halt. He's spoofing more or less because he handed it to me, and then I kind of wrote it kind of based on the intro to Star Trek 3, where Kirk's sort of, feeling despondent that Spock is dead. But as I tried to explain, it was like, the only problem with that, Doug, and you run this risk, is Star Trek 3 starts off really slow. It does not get the ball rolling fast at all. It's a very slow-moving film. So I was kind of worried that the scene wouldn't play that well because you just have this long, mopey scene, whereas this, at least, is like throwing things at you quickly and let's get us involved, let's get going. Spoonie, of course, is always fun to watch, and, he gives this great hammy performance. It's my dad playing the senator, who Doug thought was a judge. he listed him originally in the credits as judge or something, and I'm like, Doug, the Judiciary Committee is not. They're not judges; they're still senators. And he's like, oh, I don't know. And I was like, I don't blame him for that. If you're not into politics that much, you might not know that. But so, and this background actually is Union Station in Chicago. Interesting thing, I looked and looked for backgrounds of Congress or of some Senate committee hall because we went to Senate committee halls when we were lobbying Washington or lobbying in Washington, and I saw plenty there. And yet, for all of C-SPAN and everything, there is nothing that's usable. They're all small 400 by 600 pixel clips that would have been impossible to use. So I had to go with something else, and I finally found some pictures of Union Station. I was like, you know what, that looks like a government hall, and only if you're from Chicago are you gonna know. Doug came up with this idea of the commercials and the ads, which I think plays well with our whole corporate theme. I'm surprised the government hasn't done this yet, because corporations sponsor everything else. But yeah, the film brain scene and the scene with Doug, I think was good, and I think it works. There was no right or wrong way. I have pros and cons with mine. Doug has pros and cons with his. We went with Doug's, and I think it still works. The only thing I changed was Doug was very, very much having the critics' lines be about, I feel guilty, and I'm like, you can't do that. We're establishing a character arc, a story arc, and you've just given away your only, hook, which is that the critic has to realize that what he's done is wrong and apologize to Mati, and you've just done it right there. So I changed it to powerless, which seemed more in the critic's sort of, world of he always has the power, or at least wants it, like Daffy Duck, and, he never quite gets it, but he always desires it. And for the first time, he's coming to the terms with the fact that he doesn't have the power. He's being placed under house arrest now. He's, couldn't save Mati. All of his chickens are coming home to roost. God, Jim did a good job. This was actually shot in Mashad's office. It's funny, when I wrote The Flunky, I imagined him more like Kif from Futurama. I had this image of somebody who was smart but just was constantly, berated and had this sort of sighing attitude of, yes, sir. I don't know where the hell Orlando came up with this voice, but it's not what I intended, but it's funny. But when I first heard it, I'm like, wow, what is that? The sort of goofy laugh. Yes, sir. You wrote that, sir, but I had a lot of fun writing that scene, too, particularly because I hate modern Hollywood movies, particularly the really bad ones. It's another scene that was kind of fun to write. From the beginning, the way the writing process worked was Doug and I worked on Suburban Nights, and it was kind of a disaster. I'm not going to lie. I did not have a fun time working on it. What happened was I gave Doug all of these ideas, very few of which he used, and then he kind of handed me this finished draft. I mean, that's the thing. I didn't really have much of a say in Suburban Nights until the second, third draft stage. So by this point, Doug already had his plot laid out, was not really willing to compromise on much, and then left it to me to kind of fix scenes. And I did the best I could, but I wasn't satisfied with it. I came up to him and I'm just like, I think I got this. I think this time I can write the first draft. And you do what I did, basically, on Suburban Nights, which then you try to fix it. And to my eternal amazement, he agreed. I thought for sure he wasn't going to go for it. And he's like, okay. Some of that was I actually, I think, had an idea that he liked. So he kind of put trust in me to put it together. But he said, yeah, sure. So I think the first thing you notice early on is, unlike the other two films, I basically, after Suburban Nights, which some people liked, some people didn't, it wasn't my favorite of the movies, and there generally was sort of a backlash. It's calmed down a little now. Now people are kind of like, maybe it wasn't that bad, but it definitely had issues. So the first thing I did was, before I even started writing the script, I had a basic idea, but I I made a list. I opened up a notepad file and wrote down everything I thought went wrong with Suburban Nights, story-wise, because there's nothing I could do about actual production. But I'm like, story-wise, where did we go wrong? And I was just like, all critics assemble at once. I was like, we've done that twice already. In my opinion, it didn't work in Suburban Nights. It felt way too just shoehorned in. The story starts off all at once with everybody together. I thought the general plot was very razor thin of just like, well, it's a treasure hunt. The critic just finds a tape. I was like, that didn't make any sense to me. Generally, it was a lot of things like that I kept piecing together. I was like, where is this not working? And generally, what I started to figure out as I was writing, I was like, I think the problem for me was it didn't feel like a real movie. It always kind of felt like a glorified sort of episode of just like, here's a really quick plot and we'll dump some jokes in. And so the first step I did was I was like, there were two things I wanted to do. One, make it like a real movie. I'm like, so we're going to introduce characters separately. And the characters are going to meet halfway through. And it will still be a big meeting scene. Like, you can't get around that when you have a cast of 30. Which I'll probably talk about later, because we had some disagreements on that. That I'm glad in the end, for most part, I lost out on. Because having all the producers there was a blast. But so there was always going to be this concept in my head of like, we're going to parse out the plot in bits and pieces. And it's going to build, and there's going to be a real mystery early on, and all of the characters are going to be off doing their own things, and then they're going to sort of meet up. Some big event happens that forces them to meet, and the same thing sort of happens with the villains, and then we move on from there. I love this. Spoonie did this so well. This was actually one of the first color corrections I did. I wanted to spoof the scene from Star Trek 3, and there was this yellow light on McCoy's face. And so this scene was a little more brightly lit, so we turned it down, threw a yellow light on Spoonie's face in post, and put a white light on Doug. So it made the scene more moody, where only half the faces are lit, and it's got this sort of sickly glow about it, this sort of mysterious quality to it. And Jim Trokin, I owe everything to him for this, because originally I tried using spotlights, which in Premiere does not work, but I didn't know it. And he came over one Friday for 13 hours and basically saved this film in post-production, because he took one look at the color correction I was trying to do, which I didn't even realize you could do it till 2 days before the film was released. And he's like, I'm not buying it. This looks too fake. So I was like, all right, well, what would you do? Show me. And he showed me how to use the Omni lights more effectively, which I got better at as it went on. You can still tell some of these shots are not great, but... And in the cases of even some of Jim's shots, Jim had to fly through these because he only had one day to do it before going to medical school. So this was the last day, and he said, this is the last day I can do anything because I'm going to be in medical school from here on out. So we managed to really correct a lot of these scenes. I'm really grateful for him, and that was one of the first. But so yeah, I decided to parse out all the characters, have them on their own sort of separate mysteries that all intersect. So that was one part of it. And the second major part that I wanted to do differently was take it seriously, which is what, sadly, Doug wanted to do with Suburban Nights, and I got it. And I had this conversation with him because I'm like, I know what you're trying to do, Doug, and I totally appreciate it. You want to up the ante, you want to do this. We had disagreements about how to do that. Doug's opinion was you could up the ante and do all this drama while basically putting Doug in a green miniskirt and flashing his underpants. And I'm like, no. I'm like, the problem is you want people to take it seriously, but there's a certain threshold of plot and character development and story arcs and things that you need to do that. And I'm not quite sure, because it was Doug's, I think, first attempt at that, I'm not quite sure he got quite how to do it. I think he knew in his mind what he wanted, but it just wasn't parsing out right. So yeah, my thing was like, take it seriously, have the comedy, but treat the actual construction of the film like a real movie. So I paced it out in my head. It was like, this thing, particularly the first third, has to be paced perfectly. You have to set up your mysteries. We can't just throw random scenes together, and then just sort of cut them randomly together. This has to be constructed as a real narrative this time. And every single scene that's something again that I've heard a lot of directors talk about them when they get put on projects that they don't know well, or they may not be familiar with the material, or they're just like, you know what, this may not interest me, or I may have wanted to do something more serious, but it's a comedy, or they always say, the better ones anyway, have always said the same thing, well, I took it seriously. Like, even though you're doing a comedy, you take the construction of it seriously, and you're like, how am I going to do this seriously so that it works as a cohesive whole? So that was the second thing I tried to do. So you'll probably hear me talking about all of these character motivations and stuff, like, and you're probably going to sit here and be like, this is ridiculous. Like, these are people running around and it's silly and it's stupid, but if you don't do that, you can't really make a better product. It's like at least the attempt is made. So, um, yeah, something I should mention about that last scene. I wrote Dr. Block and Tease. I was aware of their characters and I really enjoyed them. And from the beginning, I had this idea that they were going to sort of be the psychologist examining Spoonie. Like the last people you want examining somebody, get them. Oh my god. This was a quick change here. For some reason, there's one thing that bothers me. Doug was adamant that he didn't want the hole mentioned as the hole. We can't know what it is. It can't be mentioned it's a plot hole. That gives too much away, this and that. And I'm like, well, Doug, they have to know that there is some connection, because what are we going to call it then? These scenes make no sense. They're just filler if we don't establish a connection. He's like, well, just call it It. Refer to it as It. And it drove me nuts. And eventually I got him to relent. The only problem was there was a line in the script where it was still referred to as, no, It. And it didn't get cut. It ends up in the final cut, and it's a holdover from when we were still calling it It, instead of referring to it as the whole. But oh, whatever. That was the problem with the script. It went through so many changes. Lost my train of thought. God, maybe I do have ADD. It's a problem with watching this. You want to comment on so many things. These were good effects. They turned out way better than I thought. I forget if this was Spoonie or Phelan. Spoonie did a lot of work on this, and then Phelan ended up doing a ton of work. And then Jim and his team did the most work out of everybody. But all of the effects turned out spectacular, so I have no regrets. This scene I do want to talk about, because the bit where we go into we break the fourth wall, and I say, I'm doing Empire, you're doing this. It's sort of a catch-all, There was this whole thing, one of the backlashes to the film was, oh, it's too much Star Wars, oh, I can't. It's plagiarism, you're plagiarizing. First, I'm going to argue no. If we were plagiarizing, we would have ripped off movies nobody knew. Like, plagiarizing is stealing something and claiming it's your own. We never did that. If you don't know Star Wars, you live in a cave, so it's very obvious what we're doing. Second, this was just something I had from the beginning. I make no apologies for it. There are some things maybe I would do differently knowing now what I know, but the bulk of it would have remained the same. And that's it. I had this concept that the villains are in their own movie, that are competing basically with what is the critics' movie, the story of the critics, and that the villains as these sort of Hollywood-esque characters get wrapped up, sort of drunk on the whole Hollywood thing, to the degree that it's like they're basically cosplaying. I think that's how I would look at it. It's a bunch of people doing what the critics did early on in our earlier movies, of just dressing up in costumes to make themselves pretend they're more important. I think the best frame of reference would be the new Muppet movie, where the villains all basically every once in a while would go maniacal laugh. It's like they're self-aware to a certain extent that that's what they're doing. So of course they're going to quote Jedi and Empire and inhabit these characters. In the case of Turl, it's because he is that character. We're claiming that is Turl from Battlefield Planet, or whatever we were calling the sort of satirical film. In the case of the Executor, though, I think it's somebody who literally just is inhabiting this role to make him look cooler. And I wrote scenes like that to kind of tell the audience that they're self-aware of this. and they're trying to make themselves look big. Maybe that didn't come off quite like I intended, because a lot of people are just like, "Oh, it's plagiarism. It's no, wrong," and I'm like, well, I thought we were kind of making it clear that they were kind of self-aware of this, but and this was a common thread throughout the entire movie, is that the most straight up satirical stuff closest to the source material always involves the villains. There's a few cases where that doesn't happen. The Star Trek 3 thing in the beginning, and I would argue the Flight of the Navigator spoof. And you can argue the Bothan scene where they're doing the rundown, but the Bothan scene involves the villains. It's how are we going to kill the villains? I always looked at that as it's them fighting fire with fire. It's like, okay, these guys are playing the Star Wars game. We can do it too. So you had this whole thing where, they're basically falling into the sort of tropes and cliches that the villains are using. But for the most part, it was always the villains who were doing it. Or it's the plot in general, the plot hole, because Mati is a villain in this. So when the plot hole's involved, like this scene, it has to do with Mati and his character and the plot hole. There was always this concept that the extraneous characters, which I consider Brian to actually be, I don't want to say extraneous, the peripheral characters that we've used in the movies of the previous films. Brian is a producer, but we used him as a villain sort of in the second movie, or in the third movie, in Suburban Nights, or Block and Tease, who are not your primary producers. He's playing the last angry geek, but he's playing him as someone else. We've made him sort of this sort of other character as well. Those characters that sort of are on the outskirts of this film, and have to dispense with all the plot information, are running on this sort of second film that's competing with the critic's main story, because most of the critic's main story is not as spoofy. We have some nods here. There's the Star Trek bridge, there's this and that, Paul wearing the Spock ears, but it's way less spoofy than the villain stuff, or the actual plot stuff. So I don't know. In my head, it worked, but I don't know. Some people didn't like it. I make no apologies. I told Doug in the beginning, I explain my concerns. I'm like, I'm doing this and I'm quoting things directly, but it may not work. This is a noble experiment of, can we tell an entire movie through other people's projects, through Star Wars, through Star Trek, and he liked it. So he never stopped me. And I actually offered to cut the executor altogether. I'm like, maybe we have too many villains. Maybe this is not the way to go about it. And he's like, no! He's like, I like it, so. Whatever, there you go. This. Okay, so during Suburban Nights, we were kind of talking about sci-fi, and we knew we were doing Star Trek 2 at the end of Suburban Nights. I'm like, you know what? I read this... No, I didn't read this story. I listened to Nicholas Meyer's commentary, and he talked about how the producers of Star Trek 2 shot this scene not knowing what to do with it, and shot it kind of in secret, and then shoehorned it in at the last second. Basically to give them an opening should they want to do Star Trek 3 and bring Spock back. And I was like, that's brilliant. I'm like, we're doing that. We're doing that in Suburban Nights in case we want to do Star Trek, in case we want to bring Mati back. So I grabbed Spoonie and Bargo and basically took off in the middle of a lunch break and shot this scene and said, we're going to do this now. I'm going to sit on it a year. We may use it, we may not. Don't mention a word of this to anybody. And I've been sitting on it for a year waiting for it to appear in the film. And it's great, particularly because Bargo left. So people, I think, were kind of curious how the hell Bargo ended up in this movie, but that's because that's year-old footage. Which works, actually, for continuity's sake, because it really looks like the field. We shot in the field a little later in the season, so it wouldn't have looked exactly like the Suburban Nights footage, so it worked great. Brian's performance here, I think, is hilarious. He had a few lines cut for pacing, but he originally was supposed to be a combination of Sarek and Obi-Wan. Originally he was supposed to be just Sarek, and as the Star Wars plot started to grow, we morphed him into Obi-Wan as well. He... I love that joke. Doug, by the way, I think really sells a lot of these moments, which is what I meant by taking it seriously. And Doug, I think, got it and pulled it off. It's like this scene is a serious moment right here. It's like spooky scene looking at Bargo, Doug staring. I was like, you have to take it seriously to make some of the comedy even work better, I think, and to just keep you invested in the story. This scene. Okay, so I'm not gonna lie. When I wrote the script originally, I basically was getting through and plowing through the first act just to get to this scene. I knew what I wanted from the beginning. I knew what I was gonna do. I knew what I was gonna spoof. And like, this is the whole reason I wrote the first act. This is the whole reason actually I told Doug I'm writing this beginning to end because I just wanted this scene written the whole way out uninterrupted by any other influence. And it is the only scene. I think this scene is virtually untouched by Doug. There were a couple lines cut, but like beginning to end, this scene just Doug didn't touch it. He inserted things, strangely enough, that weren't in this scene. The scene with him and Lindsay wasn't part of this whole section of film. But but yeah, I wrote the dialogue and I read it to Doug and Doug's just like, no, this is great. And I know for Jim Troken and I, who actually worked on this scene a lot in the editing process, this was his favorite scene as well. And it works because we were such huge fans of Flight of the Navigator as kids. Like, it's one of my favorite nostalgic movies, and this scene was the seminal scene in the movie for me. More than any other scene. Pee Wee Herman's great in that movie, and the goofy stuff is great, but the scene where they're examining David's head, and they run down through a situation like this, it was one of the best Twilight Zone moments put in a film ever. And it is so perfectly directed, edited, scored, acted, that to this day it's still haunting when I see it. As a kid, it freaked me out, and it still kind of like resonates with me. So to be able to just satirize this, I think was great, and it works on both levels because you have the comedy here first, and then it becomes legitimately dramatic, and everybody plays it perfectly. Brad always sells things. Spoonie is doing this great. Sage was wonderful giving his dramatic reads later. The only the only thing we told Brad is when he says, Spoonie, were you sexually attracted to your sister? He did it more comedically at first, and I think Doug told him, because Doug knew what I wanted. I'm like, no, like that scene in Ghostbusters with when he's interviewing the lady at the beginning, just like, Alice, are you currently menstruating right now? So Brad's like, oh, got it, because he's a huge Ghostbusters fan. He read it exactly like that, just, Spoonie, were you sexually attracted to your sister? So... but yeah, that scene was the entire reason I wrote the movie. Like, and it's my favorite scene in the film, and I think it shows. I think it's the most strongly written scene. Okay, interesting thing about this scene. This was not here originally. And there's another one where it's like the film brain scene in the beginning, which I worried may have given too much of the critic's story arc away or slowed things down. It has its pros and cons. The pro is it adds drama to the Spoonie scene in a connection there that I did not have originally. The con, there's a couple of cons here. One, for me, it's hammering a little too much Doug's, like, I'm worried about the future, I'm worried about this, which is something that I had later on in the script that developed, and I thought Doug was basically giving away too much too early, as far as the critic's character arc was concerned. And the other thing is, again, pacing. It kind of drags this scene down, especially here. It's just kind of slow. Like, and the one thing, Doug ended up cutting tons from the script, and I agreed with, I'd say, 85 to 90% of it. I'm like, they were all good cuts, no complaints. The only thing he did that pissed me off, that I'm just like, was he messed with the pacing, particularly in the first act. Because I had the whole pacing, particularly in Act 1, because I was so concerned about getting the ball rolling, set up in such a way so that it didn't seem slow. And he tossed a lot of scenes around. So you get these weird kind of moments where, in my opinion, it drags a little. So that's the con. But the pro is it is dramatic, and I love the connection. I told him I love the idea. The idea totally works. Like, I love the concept behind it. It just there were just pros and cons to it. Yeah, and here's where things get dramatic. The other con to that scene was a lot of people were kind of, particularly there were a few producers who were complaining that Brian's scene was kind of draggy, which is not on Brian. I mean, I'm the one who wrote it. Here's what happened, because I was trying to figure out what was going wrong. I'm like, what happened here? Because like somebody were like, well, it's kind of superfluous, and and it's all there in a sort of chunk. Doug broke it up with Sci-Fi Guy scene at the last second because I told him something had to be done with the Brian scene, so we moved that scene. But I'm like, what happened here? Why isn't this working? And Jim was asking that too. He's like, yeah, I don't. What did you like? Why did you write it that way? Because Jim was kind of like, Jim was coming to me. He's like, well, the first act seemed good, but why would you do that? It's just such a huge chunk. I'm like, you know what, Jim? I'm gonna be honest. I don't think I did. So I went back to my original draft, and here's what happened. We had the first half of the Brian scene up until where Doug says, "Wait, maybe there's a way." Mati would have found a way. This was one of those desperate jokes I basically just went for at the last end, because Doug just had a joke about, oh, you're a slut, and I forget what Allison's retort was, but I was desperate for anything, so I just came up with this idea, about Argentinian soccer team crash landing on her breasts and being forced to eat themselves, and it was a last ditch effort, and I think it actually kind of worked. God, I love this bit. But in the original scene, it ends. The Brian scene ends with Doug saying, "Well, maybe there's a way." Cut then to the Spoonie scene with the doctors, and they run through that scene, and basically up to the point where he says Mati, it's Mati, and this and that, and the computer explodes. Then you cut back to Brian, who then says, you cut back to the security camera footage. So after we reveal that Mati's in Spoonie there with the computer, that there's something weird with Mati and Spoonie, then Doug's looking at the computer footage and he's like, that's it. That's the connection. So I had paced it out so that you get all of your plot information there all at once, so that there's nothing superfluous about it. The problem is, as it works now, Brian tells you everything that you are going to find out in this scene well ahead of time. This scene, as much as I love it, is actually completely superfluous. It's only to tell the other characters there that Mati is actually, there. But we now, as an audience, know that, which kind of bugged me a bit, because I'm like, well, poor Brian in his scene now just doesn't really have as much of a point. Or it makes this scene not have a point, but this scene I think is so well put together that Brian's scene actually is the one that suffers, because people generally like this scene no matter what. There is an Easter egg in here. Doug and I were really worried about pacing. He had so many scenes of Lindsay and himself looking at the computer that Jim and I kept trying to tell him, you need to cut it, and Doug wouldn't, so Jim and I secretly probably cut about 30 seconds out of this sequence. And most of that was just Doug and Lindsay looking at the computer. And Jim and I, because we had to redo all the effects, we had to color code the orange and the green, because Doug had these all in color and was grabbing just random images. He had like cave paintings and weird things. It wasn't making any sense. So I'm like, Doug, you know what? I'm taking over this scene. I'm taking it away from you. Jim and I are going to do it. So Jim and I grabbed all the images, cut them all together, color corrected every one of them. All of them were in color originally. We came up with this idea that the computer's images in Doug's house would be green, and the ones in Spoonie's would be orange, because Jim and I were getting confused whose computer was being looked at, because Doug would cut to random images. I'm like, well, is this in the office, or is this at Doug's place? So we re-edited the sequence. I spent a ton of time foleying the whole thing, getting all the sound effects in, getting the images done. Jim did these effects, which are great. I told him what I wanted. I was like, make it look like that scene in Flight of the Navigator with the squares when it's zooming in on the solar system, pointing out Phelan. And it worked out really great, but so we had this one Easter egg in there, because Jim and I basically cracked at one point. We were so sick of looking at the scene and editing it. And it was so difficult to edit because there were so many cutaways back to Doug and Lindsay looking at the computer, and we had to insert the scenes back in there or color correct them or fix things, that we did insert one little line somewhere in there that said something to the effect of, I edited this scene better than Doug did. And I didn't think anyone would notice it. Somebody noticed it right away on the internet. Like, it was the first thing that got noticed. I was like, whoops. And Doug was kind of like, how did that end up in there? And I'm like, oh, I don't know. Maybe Jim did it. But to be fair, I will say this. Jim was the one who, like, was pushing me to do it. And he's like, dude, you should totally do that. I'm sick of looking at this scene. I'm sick of all of these cutaways back, and we have to do all these effects over because he keeps cutting back to himself looking at the computer, and, you know, we should just do that. So we did as a joke, but this scene's another Flight of the Navigator reference. The story goes that Spoonie got offended by this because he's like, hey, we're not D-list internet celebrities. You know, we're at least B-list, this and that. I'm like, you know, Noah, you have to have a sense of humor about yourself. I mean, I rip into the critic's character a lot in this movie, so, but Spoonie, if you can't tell, I think sometimes is, I don't know. he just took a lot of offense at that. He's like, I'm not D-list! No way! All right, it was just a joke, but here's where the Ghostbusters humor comes in, and again, I didn't mind because it's this second movie invading the critics, and whenever it's, the pattern generally is whenever it's the plot hole or the villains coming in to interact, you know, or shut things down or something, we're spoofing a film. This, I think, was Nella's suggestion, and it was brilliant. She's like, I should just open up an umbrella or something. I'm like, do it. I wish I came up with that. It's so brilliant. Brad's delivery. No. I wish I had come up with that because it was so funny, and it's like, I was like, damn it, I wish I could claim credit for that. That was Nella. And it was just a brilliant joke. But yeah, my thought always was just spoof the Ghostbusters scene. I thought it would be funny, you know, people know what we're doing, and Prick is so full of himself that this is how he handles it. He thinks of himself as this great government bureaucrat. He's always overstepping his bounds. Actually, the original line there was, shut it down anyway, and then tell me how to make my wiener as large as his. Originally, he was going to be encouraged. Like, I don't care about the size of it. Really? Wow, that's amazing. But there was a line that Doug cut that I begged him to keep, and I wish he did, because it basically hammered in what I was trying to do. And he comes in, and Brad's like, you know, can I help you? And basically, Prick says, you know, you know, you thought it would be more fun to make fun of me. Well, now it's my turn, wise ass. Completely doing the line from Ghostbusters, and Brad says, dude, I just met you. Like, are you in the right film? Like, it was something to that basic effect, which hammered in the fact that Prick is in his own universe running off a different movie. Doug cut it. And I think you lose a little bit of that aspect of, you know, this is, you know, this is kind of what I was going for, that the villains basically are in their own separate movie, kind of drunk on their own, you know, sort of Hollywood sort of, you know, what they want to be or be seen as. We got a lot of flack for this too, which surprised me. And again, people like, let's play the rhythm. Oh, I can't believe you would just rip this off. It's too close. Too close. And I'm like, well, what do you want me to do with it? There was always this concept that they shut Spoonie down, and that link that Spoonie has to the plot hole, which was played up more in the original draft. That's Jim there, by the way. We sat on the top of the Hancock building in their observatory, and because we were just in the restaurant there, looking for a moment, would tell Jim at random moments, I'm just like, turn. Because I would see people pointing at something. I'm like, okay, turn now. Because people would get up in the back of the restaurant and take pictures or something. And we finally got one where he turned and it looked so cool. It's like a perfect trailer shot. But Jim and I wandered around the city, covered 6 miles of the loop, and basically tried to get some of the major landmarks. And I consider it my love letter to Chicago, because I always kind of wondered, like, I was always upset that great movies like Ghostbusters and stuff are not shot in Chicago, because it's a picturesque city and really cool. So I kind of had this idea. I was like, well, you know what? We're doing this anyway. You know, the concept is similar to Ghostbusters. Jim showed me what he could do, and I'm like, dude, let's just go all out. Like, let's just do that scene from Ghostbusters. And, you know, some people were just all like, I can't believe you did it. It's a plagiarism. Which, again, I don't get. How is it plagiarism when everybody knows what you're doing? Now, I mean, if you want to say it's ripping off, fine, but it's not. We're not stealing something with the attempt of claiming it's ours. You have to be living in a cave to not know. Like, that this isn't Ghostbusters. But everybody, that was the other thing, like, everybody pretended that they were the only one. Now, I'm sorry, but I noticed it was Ghostbusters. As if it were a secret, and as if they were somehow the ones who figured it out. Like, okay, if you say so. Interesting thing, the original concept was the critic flashes a signal or something, and I had it written that they all assemble in a Reservoir Dogs moment where they walk down the street. Or like Transformers, like Optimus Prime, Transformers assemble! Doug didn't like that because it would have taken too long to shoot, and I don't necessarily blame him on that. I argued with that a lot, and I probably shouldn't have. It really was not something worth arguing over. And this, I think, kind of worked. So, yeah, here we get our big assemble scene, which was something we always had to do. Like, I couldn't figure out a way around this. I love Doug's hello again. There was no way I couldn't do this because we have 30 producers. And we have to get them all together somehow. As it stands, they're still not all together. Some have cameos later, and Linkara just has disappeared. He's there as Mechakara, but this was one of my worries in the draft of putting the death bomb early on in the film. Because one of the things Doug cut was, I added in the original draft that the death bomb was being built while the villains were doing things. Doug's like, it's too extraneous, it's going to take too long to explain, drop it. And he's right. The problem is he had the death bomb firing early to destroy Sci-Fi Guy's house. Originally I just added that it was Turl's ship that did it. And I just worried that this was too much to introduce quickly. Like, now there's a weird super weapon, and it fired on Sci-Fi Guy's house, and I thought maybe the audience just would kind of get lost and be like, what the heck? I think overall it worked. This was another fun scene to write. In federal custody. And that was kind of fun, too, to bring characters in kind of separately. I don't know why. I always had this concept of, like, you know, kind of Empire Strikes Back, where they're going to, like, kind of put him in, like, almost like carbon freeze. So that was a way to ship Spoonie into space, or our original plan was actually a secret base on Earth called Area 52, but so I couldn't come up with anything. I was like, we can't do a whole carbon freeze thing. That'd be too expensive. So I thought, you know, cardboard freeze. This is a fancy way of saying you're putting me in a cardboard box. This is one of my favorite jokes. I put that in the script and Doug read it, and he's like, that's brilliant. We're doing that. We're just totally doing that. The callback to Suburban Nights. And plus I like the concept of everybody still arriving at different points. You know, even though we assembled everybody all at once, they're still kind of trailing in. It also was sort of an in-joke, because I think Jess Otak originally was supposed to come on Suburban Nights, but we ran out of people to bring, so... CR, I think, was supposed to be there, too, but he had family issues, so they kind of got cut, unfortunately, but they made it this time. We changed a few things here. Doug, again, was kind of, in my opinion, giving too much away. He still kind of throws it, like... I was trying to show the evolution of the critic's character from jerk to human being. Like, rational, good human being. And my problem was he kind of still... For my taste, it's still probably still a little oversold. Like, I'm concerned about Mati. I'm concerned about this. Do it for... And I'm like, that's nice, but there probably were ways to kind of bring that in slowly over the course of the movie, but it's kind of a small gripe. Um, I think overall it works. From I love everybody's reaction. This this is another one of those scenes that I had in the original script and remained unchanged, where they do this sort of like bit off each other. The one interesting change in the original script, Luke was not there in the beginning. He was a later addition of sort of being hooked up with Cinema Snob. It was just Bennett and Brad. So there was kind of this problem of like Luke, unfortunately, is always in the background, so we were coming up ways to give him a line. I love the way he does that, You did great. The little kind of bromance nod. Like, aw. Okay, here it comes. Aw. I did not write the role originally as being kind of bromancy as it was. Some of that is the way Doug shot it, and some of that I think Luke and Filmbrain just came up with by themselves. I had it that they were really good friends, and it was probably vaguely Lord of the Rings, just like a Frodo, Sam, Aragorn, sort of, there was that bromance in those movies, but they played it up way more than I probably ever originally intended, so it wasn't my intent to write Brokeback Mountain with Luke and Brad, but I guess things kind of fell into place. But this was always here, and this is another one of those scenes that, as much as certain things got changed in the script once Doug got his hands on it, nothing here really changed all that much. We had arguments about it. Um, Doug was desperate to drop certain lines. Like, there's too many lines, and I'm like, well, yeah, but Doug, this basically is setting up the entire rest of the film. I had paced this so that from here on out, you've basically established what it is out there, what it is the critics need to do, how important it is, and basically where they're getting all their stuff. And from here on out, this is where the entire story is going to go. Because Doug's like, we need to get to space. We need to get to space. It's too long without getting to space. And I told him, I'm like, don't be desperate to get to space. It's going to be too claustrophobic. We're filming in one house. The more you spend in space, the more boring it's actually going to look. So don't be too desperate to get to space. So he cut some things out of the first act, most of which generally I was okay with, but I just told him, I'm like, don't be desperate to do that. So when he wanted to cut lines here, I told him no, absolutely not. For one thing, like, he wanted to cut the bit about how time isn't linear, how it's this whirly thing like a David Lynch movie. He wanted to basically take out the science of the plot hole, and I'm like, no, because the science of the plot hole is kind of fun, and it also explains everything in the rest of the movie. The scene where Bennett says, well, it also explains how we can't know the perfectly obvious things right in front of us, and he says, isn't that right, Linkar? And he says, precisely. Like, that was a nod to the fact that they're not noticing the fact that anybody's assimilating, or that Linkar is assimilating the rest of the crew. That is the plot hole. It's stated right there. It explains our holes in the past. When we talk about it's how Spoonie could be two separate people, which was one of the first things I wanted to do when I came up with the idea of the plot hole. I'm like, that's the first thing I'm going to put in there, because so many of Spoonie's fans gave us hell for that. And I'm like, well, you know what? We're going to use the plot hole to explain that. It's like that anomaly in the Next Generation finale. It works in the past, present, and future. So I kind of theorized it that the plot hole is going to be worse in the present or kind of the future, or the closer you get to it, and that it's least probably in the far-off past, but that it gets consecutively worse, so that it gets consecutively worse in the films. Because I think Suburban Nights, to me, I think had the most plot holes in them, generally. It's this idea that they get progressively worse until you get to this movie where it's nothing but plot holes. He took the novelty slot machine. But the only thing I hated about that, I didn't know that line was there. That was ad-libbed. Because that was shot in our friend James's basement, and he had a novelty slot machine. I, I so wish, had I known that, I would have insisted that the novelty slot machine is somewhere on the bridge. But unfortunately, Doug, or nobody did that. Bennett storing his stash. But yeah, he wanted to cut a lot of the science behind it. I'm like, no, this scene stays as is. And I argued him to the point that it did stay as is. And I think it works better for it. As it stands, it was loosely based on that scene from Back to the Future 2, where Doc Brown explains the temporal paradox and uses the chalkboard and everything. So I kind of took that as just sort of my starting point and then kind of wrote it vaguely similar to that. But one thing I did do for the DVD is added gratuitous Jim Abrams style Star Trek lens flares. One of the jokes I never got around to was one of the things they were going to say on the bridge is, do this, engage warp drive, and activate Jim Abrams style lens flares. There would just be like 8 lens flares that go and just come on all at once, but didn't throw it in the script and forgot to really suggest it on the set, so I was conscious that the idea was the lens flares were going to be up until the surprise attack. When I was doing this is one of the last things I did was added the lens flares really about a week ago before this commentary. And then fix things like color corrected engineering beginning to end. Some of those color corrections weren't done initially, so. But I had this idea that the lens flares would stick around until about the surprise attack, and the idea was that the lights were probably blown out, so I didn't want them to be distracting beginning to end. But I did want them early on, A, to spoof the new Trek film, but B, it was so claustrophobic in that set. And the one thing the lens flares do, even if they look really fake, they do give you the optical illusion of opening things up, of making things brighter, and making it look like there's probably more space there than there is, or things look more technical than they are, so. It's another fun bit to write. Jim ad-libbed that line. I don't care if they're Jimmy fucking Choos. It's one of my favorites, actually. I just had some fancy shoe name. I had to look them up online. It's not like I wear good shoes. Ed and Greg did such a great job of playing these two MIB agents. It was one of the more fun bits to write. Interesting thing, the original plot had them going to a secret base, Area 52, where Spoonie was being held, and Spoonie was going to be picked up there, and then they go to Europa. It could have been done originally. Linkara, I sent an early draft to Linkara. He's like, I don't know how you're going to do this. This is really... But knowing what we know about the special effects now, wouldn't have been too difficult. But the problem is, once we lost Bargo, and once we took the plot a different direction because we lost Bargo, that scene became completely superfluous. And as many great bits we had there, and I'll talk about them later probably, it couldn't work. I was like, it's too pointless, and I agreed. I'm like, Doug, we need to cut this. That may have been one cut I suggested, like, do we need this? And he's like, no. And I'm like, I was sad to lose it because I had so many great bits written for it, but no. So Mickey kind of runs hot cold on this stuff. Like, he doesn't like the short jokes, so I wrote this actually as his final revenge. Like, I was just be like, you're going to get your payback for all the short jokes we've made. Completely rip this guy to shreds for making fun of you. And I love Jim's smarminess. It was a great way to kill Prick, too. But I couldn't tell. Then he seemed upset. He's like, yeah, but you turned me into a complete psycho. And I was like, well, I thought you'd want to have your revenge. I thought it was good. You take out a main villain. So he kind of ran a little hot and cold on that, but I think he liked it in the end. I wrote it not really to make fun of Mickey, but to basically be like, well, now you're going to get your moment to shine. Like, after all of this, basically making fun of you, we're going to really, give you a moment to, have your revenge. But he got kind of upset by it, but oh well. One of my favorite lines in the movie. Why? I'm not leaving the house. More gratuitous lens flares. I absolutely love this sequence, and I love the effects that Jim's team did. You will believe a house can fly. Interesting side note, there's some of the things we lost in the script. It's actually probably a good time to talk about them because I don't know what I'm going to have here. Oh, that was a pain. I had to make the lens flare conk in and out as Luke passes in front of it. That was one thing I was conscious of, to try to at least make it seem somewhat ambient. Spoonie's reaction is great. I love that. The only thing I wish we could have done is in the original draft, the entire room turns red when they put Prick's remains on screen. Thought did not occur to me that the problem with this background is it's already red, so I was like, oh, shit. Like, well, that joke won't work, but I think you get the idea. Especially like, where was his nose? Love that look. Oh, crap. Yeah, some of the changes that did happen in the first part, because the first part was written before Bargo left. So the idea always is that there would be Bargo's body wandering around like Spock's body in Star Trek 3. But we didn't get to do that because we lost Bargo, so that changed some things. But the original draft had the critic didn't get all of the equipment from Dr. Insano. He got one device, which was a portal gun, and they were going to use that to sneak into Area 52. The idea was we had the house land on top of the base, kind of connect to it, and Doug had this entire long convoluted plan of just like, oh, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to knock out the guards. We're going to do this to pass them. And Phalos was going to say, or we could just use the portal gun. You know, when Doug's like, where did you get that? I stole it from Dr. Insano. He's like, why didn't you tell me these things? He's like, I did 100 times, you know. So he's like, all right, we'll use the portal gun. And they're like, but you can't leave the house. And he's like, well, technically we've landed on top of this place, so if we just fire through the floor, this is my basement. So they were going to use this, fire through the floor, and pick Spoonie up there. Which was one idea. Another idea is it changed eventually when Bargo left, and Spoonie was... They were going to stop Spoonie and try to get Spoonie Empire Strikes Back style, but he's like lifted away on a spaceship, you know, like Leia and Chewie and Lando trying to get him back, but Boba Fett gets him. And at that point, I think we realized we had to cut the scene altogether. Because like, it doesn't make any sense. If they're not going to pick up Spoonie there, there's no point to doing this. But yeah, so the original draft had them picking up Spoonie there, and there was this great sequence where they couldn't figure out how to slip past security. So Benzai was in the original draft. That got changed. I had nothing to do with that. They're like, we're bringing Sad Panda instead. I'm like, okay, I'll rewrite all of that. But in the original, it was going to be Benzai there, and they couldn't figure out how to slip past security. So they had to do something to the video cameras. So they created a distraction, and what it was Doug basically looking at Lindsay, and something to the effect of how attached are you to your clothes or something, and she's like, how attached are you to her head? And it looks like they're making Lindsay either undress or something, or basically change out of her clothes, and she's like, I don't want to do this, and critic's like, you have to. And it cuts to this security camera footage. And the guards are watching this, and you see this kind of hot, like, what looks like a female leg. And then they're all, like, you know, fawning over this, like, oh yeah. And it's like the Uhura fan dance from Star Trek V. It was spoofing that, and they're like, oh, just like Star Trek V. And finally it backs off, and it turns out it's Benzai, and he does the Benzai dance with a bunch of fan fronds or whatever. You know, hi, my name's Benzai. If you know me, you know I like kissing guys. And they were all just going to be, like, horrified and basically, like, trying to scrub their eyes out with steel wool or something. So we had that bit. Prick's death originally was going to be at Area 52. Mickey stops him. The Men in Black stuff was going to be there, too. But it just, once we lost Spoonie, there was no point to it. Nash had a huge cameo because he was the one that was going to give them the secret, you know, codes to basically get past the radar to get in there. And there was this whole subplot about how he has secret plans to everything. Like, you know, for for reasons nobody knows about. I kind of wrote him like Mr. Universe or something from what was that, guys? I think it was that from Serenity. And then that was going to tie in with the way he comes back later. It's like they go back to him, but and that was going to be another thing for Jesu Otaku to do, was she was going to be the one who suggested, like, oh, I kind of have an idea, and then they talked to Nash. So, but yeah, that got cut. I didn't mind that because it would have been fun, but there was no point once we had to move Spoonie to Europa. This was one of those scenes that was insane. Actually, the Tao Takei was a later addition. Doug had Juwario going through all of these different sort of plot ideas, and we finally settled on this George Takei thing. So I actually made that book cover. There are people are asking, where do I buy that book? And I'm like, I'm sorry. I made the cover myself. Like, I may just throw it on a DeviantArt page or something if people want it, but the funny thing is the book is George Takei's autobiography, To the Stars. I used that and pasted the cover over it so that the back of George Takei folding his arms is, really the dust jacket from the book. But I was like, what you need, tits. And this sets up Cinema Snobs and Luke's story arc, and that was one of those things where I think we were much better for bringing Luke in earlier, because their story arc would have started here otherwise. I think that would have been a lot to cover. But this whole section was really difficult because I'm not going to lie, I did not want 30 producers. And it has nothing to do with not liking the producers. I love all of our producers. They're a ton of fun. But I wanted to write this like a real movie, and I'm like, you can only have 15 characters tops before it gets unruly and it just becomes too much of a clusterfuck, too much of trying to shoehorn people in, or too long. Doug actually likes to complain that he's like, well, Rob, your original draft, like the first act was an hour and a half, and I'm like, yeah, but as I told you, you were supposed to cut things out, and you did. Like, the original act would not have been 80 minutes. My guess is, at most, the original act would have been about an hour, considering all the things Doug cut. And the funny thing is, Doug cut things, but he also put stuff in that was not in there originally. So I'm like, if you took the things Doug put in to try to shoehorn producers in, if you took those out and done the cuts that we did, it would not have been an hour and a half first act. But whatever, I mean, that's fine. But the problem is, like, I initially wanted less people because I wanted to write it like a real movie. In a real movie, you have just a certain set number of characters. You don't have 30 people. Not if you want a real dedicated plot or don't want it to be like 4 hours long. So this was a great joke. We didn't know how to show them constructing a house. Originally, we were going to do just they're always on this bridge. And I was like, you know what? That's going to get claustrophobic. You still know it's a green screen, even though Mirabadur, did a great job. So it's like, but how do you do a transformation quick? Do you just cut? And it was like, no, I think it was me, maybe it was Doug. One of us came up with the idea, just do a George Lucas wipe. It's a great fourth wall joke. And the plant in the corner was always something there from the beginning that I just wanted something to acknowledge the sort of Susie Homemaker quality of it. It is like the Martha Stewart quality of just like, oh, there's a lovely plant in the corner. And the irony of it is when we staked out James's place, he had his place remodeled, like built a huge addition to his house. So this is his new living room. He really had a plant in the corner, and we just broke out laughing. He's like, I don't get it. What's so funny? And he's just like, you actually have a plant in the corner. He's like, yeah. He's like, that was in our script. He's like, oh, great. So that we didn't even need to buy a plant. This is one of those lines I threw in there only because the first time Spoonie and I got into Dune quoting, he did a pitch-perfect Baron Harkonnen. And he did this line, and I was like, you know what, this is a conceit, but I want this in there. But I made the payoff the whole Ferdinand von Turl thing, so. But So yeah, the story behind it is I thought we could do this with about 15 producers and make it more like a real film. Doug and Mashad completely overruled me on that, which is fine. Um, it does have its one drawback, which is what was in many respects a real movie once they all get together kind of goes back sort of in some respects to the pattern we had in the first two films. um, I guess our first three if we're counting the brawl, which is try to fit as much as we can in with giving these producers something to do. But on the bright side, I think we did probably the best job out of any of the films in doing that this time around. But I'm not gonna lie, like Doug would come. Like I had sort of a concept of like it was smaller producers. The original plot was they were gonna go to Europa, and originally it was gonna be like Star Trek 3 where they find Bargo's body. There was this whole subplot about Europa was a planet that was coming to life, which is only touched upon in the redraft. Um, and that eventually, though, the planet ends up being destroyed, so that the plot hole in the end destroys all things, kind of like the Genesis planet in Star Trek 3, which is why the executors' plans were so evil because it would kill everybody. Then we change it to, well, it'll be like the not the Genesis planet, but the Genesis device, where it will create new life where there wasn't life before, but destroy life on planets that already have life. That's what the plot hole will do. So, but there was definitely a different plot. It was definitely smaller groups of people interacting, and you saw little pieces of that, I think, in the middle of the movie. But it definitely gets like really complicated with all the stuff we kind of had to do, and like the whole love interest thing. Like I never planned on having a love interest, a love triangle. And after a third of the way through the script, when I was in the middle of the second act, because I told I'm like, I've got your first act covered, and the first act was 80. By the time it's all said and done with Doug's changes, it's 80% me. But I told him straight up, I'm like, I don't have much for the second act. Once they get into space, I have ideas, but how to do things in the house and stuff. If you have ideas for some of the producers, feel free. So what happened? What happened was Doug. I'm like, give me bullet points. Give me a list or something, and then I'll write the script around that. Just tell me what your ideas are. He he comes back, and this is after he complained that my first act was overly long. He comes back with this laundry list of like 40 plot points. And he's like, okay, there's going to be an Inception style dream machine. There's going to be a love triangle with Lupa. Jew Wario is going to. I don't even remember what Jew Wario's original plot was, but this is going to happen. This is going to happen. I just couldn't believe it. I'm just like, okay. And at that point, I literally decided I'm like, I give up. In that moment, what I was trying to do as like a real 2.5 hour movie, I suddenly just threw my hands in the air, went for broke, and said, okay, if this is how you want to do it, this is how we'll do it. We'll have 30 producers and we'll try to give them all some sort of moment. But this is going to be like a 4-hour film. And I thought that was a conservative estimate. And when I wrote it, I'm like, from this point forward, Doug, I am writing this as a miniseries. It is a miniseries now. I am writing it as a miniseries in mind. It is no longer a movie. Which is fine. I love miniseries. I have nothing wrong with that. And a good, Children of Dune, things like Game of Thrones, there are fantastic miniseries out there. And that's totally cool, and it's a legitimate art form. So I'm, oh god, I'll have to talk about that scene in a second. So, but yeah, that was my way around it. I'm like, and I'm gonna write this as long as humanly possible, and you can just cut it. So I actually gave him, I think it was something like a 380-page script, and said, here you go, cut whatever you want. And he did actually a really good job. He's like, extraneous, extraneous, don't need it, can be shortened, cut. And we got it down to about the length we have now. So, but that's how I will always look at this film now. It is a mini series, not a straight up movie. And it, my only small regret is I wondered what would have happened had we gone with a smaller group, and what the story would have progressed and looked like had we not lost Bargo, had all of these other things not happened, had we not gotten involved in the SOPA battle. Um, but I'm really satisfied with what we came up with. So it's different than when I started out when I typed page one, but that's life and that happens. So I'm no regrets, and I think what we managed to pull out for what we had to do is actually really, really good. So this scene, oh my god. Okay, so long story behind this scene. I wrote this scene originally as a double layered joke. The first one is she gets assimilated. And I wrote it initially as a terrifying scene. It was supposed to be scary, that she was supposed to have sort of a scared reaction because he was going to assimilate her. That was the point. And from what I gathered from watching Next Generation, it's not a pleasant thing. I imagine he was going to turn her into a robot, and that would involve, all sorts of construction work. And it was supposed to be kind of a spooky alien sort of scene, like, ooh, what's going to happen? The payoff to the joke was supposed to be that the sounds that Film Brain's hearing were so goofy and cartoony, and that it's so obvious it's her being assimilated, but he confuses it for them getting it on. So you were supposed to have something scary that turns into something kind of funny and goofy. Somewhere down the line, Doug got a hold of this scene and then added lines that Lindsay was going to say to make it more clear that Film Brain should be thinking that she's getting it on with him. This this somehow kind of made the scene, the only way I can put it is more rapey. It probably didn't bother me as much as it did Lindsay and Linkara, but I know where they were coming from. So the thing was, I explained, I got nothing but complaints about it. And I think for the most part they were justified, because the way Doug shot the scene, it was supposed to be a drill or computer parts or something to make it clear that, he was going to turn her into a robot. But the original way it was shot, when Kara pulls out like a long drill screw and sticks it between his fingers as if it were his middle finger. And they're telling me this. I wasn't there when this was shot, and I'm like, oh my god. So I insisted to them, I insisted to Lindsay. I'm like, listen, Lindsay, I will not let the scene come out if I think it's gonna look like you were getting raped. I will personally edit the scene myself and work on it. So I did do that. I did the Foleying. Doug did the original Foleying, and poor Doug, as he says, he's like, I'm just too naive. I don't get, what the problem is, like, because I don't think that way. But his original Foleying was like violent slams against the wall and glass breaking and all of these thuds and these strange screams out of Lindsay. And I'm like, no, Doug, no, we can't do this. So I tried to add the Transformers sound effects and little drill sounds and sort of construction sounds to try to make it clear what was happening. But the joke of it was, like, Lindsay settled down and she's like, no, I trust you. And I told her, I was like, I'll let you see the scene first. I'm not going to, and if you're really that concerned about it, we'll cut it. She was fine with this. Lewis, for whatever reason, would not let it drop. And the entire shoot kept going on and out about it, and would keep saying, and I'd be like, Lewis, I'll handle it. And he would keep saying, Doug wrote a rape scene. He kept saying it so much that it became one of the running jokes on the set, because we were kind of joking that he sounds like a brother tattling on his parents. So we were kind of running around for a while on the set just shouting, Mom, Doug wrote a rape scene. But he kept going on and on about just like, this may violate my feminist principles, so I'm gonna have to look this up online and see what sort of literature is, And I'm like, Lewis, I kept trying to explain to him. I was like, because that was the other thing. He says, you realize he's like, it's a phallic symbol. It's a screw. It's a phallic symbol. I'm like, Lewis, any device is a phallic symbol. You have to turn her into a robot somehow. And on Next Gen, it was some sort of weird blade-like thing that came out of their hands, which I think Doug was going for. Like, any of that's gonna be a phallic symbol. There's nothing you can do about it. Like, and he's like, well, it's like a rape. It's like, I'm like, the Borg are like a rape, Lewis. Like, you can't get around that. It's like, blame the writers of Next Generation. Um, as it stands, I was like, one of the things I was tinkering with is I was like, maybe we should just go the Next Gen route. And she has this Picard meltdown moment, like after Best of Both Worlds, where she's like, they violated me. They made me do things I didn't want to do. I hurt my friends. But maybe we should have done that. But some people picked up on that and were just like, well, it's like a violation. And it's like, well, somebody did point it out in the comments page, and I'm like, and they really nailed it because they were just like, well, but that's always what the Borg are. They're always violating you. They're violating your mind. They're taking over your body. They're making you do things you don't want to do. So you can't get around that. For me, it's not really an issue. But yeah, that probably was like the biggest thing, and that dogged us till basically the episode was released. It's like, all right, send it to Lindsay, see what she says. And the irony of it was she's just like, I don't think it's particularly funny, but no, I don't really have a problem with it as is. And the funniest thing about it is in the rough cut, Doug comes back to me. He's just like, so yeah, no, Lewis had a few things here or there he noticed. Like, guess what the one thing Lewis didn't notice, Rob? I'm like, let me guess. He's like, yeah, the quote unquote rape scene. So, but all's well that ends well. It worked out. It did lead to one of the funniest stories of the shoot, though, in my opinion. So, oh, this scene. So, the real reason, there were two reasons things got delayed on the release schedule for this film. One was there was trouble exporting the first two acts, which meant that I couldn't color correct things. And the problem is, like, this whole scene is color corrected with ambient lighting added in post. And this was done because when I said let's use James's basement, I thought Doug was going to shoot against that foil wall and have a few props. Instead, the whole thing is lit very bright, and you can clearly see that this is just like some dude's basement. And Doug had things like coat hangers and stuff. As Brian says, Doug sometimes misses the little details, and little things, that make it look like a house that's lived in the cabinets, and Doug all left them in the shot, so I was like, we have to hide this somehow or make it less obvious. So, at the last second, Jim Trokin showed me how to color correct and relight certain scenes. I'm like, I didn't know any of this. If I had known this, I would have done this with all these scenes. Well, this is 2 days before episode 1 goes up. So, I'm like, okay, well, I'll do this and we'll color correct it. Well, the problem is Doug had trouble exporting, so I couldn't get into any of the color correction until the day of the release. I think after the release of episode 1. And on a 2-day release schedule, I'm like, I can't keep up with this. Like, this is actually hard work doing this for somebody who, like, I had no training in this. Jim just gave me a crash course. He's like, here's everything you need to know, the very basics. Just do the best you can, because he had to go to medical school. So Jim handled about 3 or 4 key scenes, but the rest was left up to me. So yeah, that's actually was the biggest reason things got delayed, because there were so many things, and there were effects in the plot hole. Doug's original plan was to have the plot hole background just completely black. And I'm like, it just didn't add to the drama. It's like, there are things we need to fix to get people to take this seriously. And people were like, oh, it needs to be released faster. And I'm like, sorry, but if you want it looking good, it doesn't have to look perfect, but it has to look better. So yeah, I mean, if you look at the scene, this was all completely bright. So I tinkered with a few separate lights. I decided to go with basically green. I kind of figured it looked secret base-ish. I was going to go cyclone originally and kind of do it like purple, but wasn't looking right. So it's not our best color correction job. It was the first thing Jim and I did, and we just were going through as fast as we could because we only had like a day. to get through a number of scenes, but it's serviceable. It's another one of those scenes that actually never got changed all that much. People really, for some reason, latched onto that line. Kind of reminds me of Monty Python. What are you doing in England? Holy Grail. I always have this concept. I kind of watch Food Network and, just kind of find the programming kind of funny, and it was just on my brain when I wrote it, so I was just looking for some way to turn the lasers off, and I just had this concept of, like, borrow a cup of sugar. It just sounded so ridiculous in my head that the villains are just like, their clever ruse was asking for a cup of sugar. It's, like, so old school. Funny thing is, Doug was not sold on this until that line. The whole "it does sound like Oprah" line. Doug's like, "All right, we're keeping this in." He's like, "This works." um, the only thing that got cut a bit was this scene was a little different. It was supposed to be more obvious that they were turning the torpedoes off or busting something up. So that was a little different. I love Spoonie's reaction. He really sells that. And there was it made a little more sense the way that the shields weren't loaded and what spoiler alert did. And Doug cut those lines because people were asking questions like, well, why didn't they do this when? And I was like, I had it explained. Doug's like, well, we don't need it. These effects actually were all me at the last second. Jim added the red alert, sort of red glowing light, but Jim had to go to medical school, and I was like, okay, I guess I will put all of these smoke and explosion and like spark effects in. Jim did a couple of them, but I apologize if they look really fakey. I tried to kind of make it look cool enough. I'm like, if it looks a little cartoony, so be it. We're a low budget sci-fi film. I didn't have time to track all the smoke, so the smoke's not going to move quite with the camera, but I do love this one shot. Watch the smoke to the left. Whoosh. I did do that. I was able to have just enough time to do little things like that and kind of have the smoke rotate, but that was the biggest problem. Is like, to make it look cool, we shook the camera, and then in post, I'm just like, oh crap. This made the smoke really difficult. But and here the lens flares. I think there may be one lens flare left, but after red alert goes off, they kind of die. I love that. I told Doug to make sure he looks like Khan from Star Trek 2. The best compliment we got is that somebody said Turl and Zod remind them of Krang and Shredder from the old Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles cartoon. They're kind of like a married couple. It. One thing I had from the beginning when we were talking about spoofing Star Trek was, I'm like, I'm gonna have his Shakespeare all be wrong. We're gonna quote Shakespeare like Nicholas Meyer's films do. Only he's just always gonna get it wrong. So from the very beginning, he just gets all of these lines wrong. Interesting thing, in the original draft, it was not Sad Panda. And I think Phalis was there, but it was Jesu Otaku. Because her character in the original draft was actually a straight role. She was much like CR was. And she was going to play basically the Savick role, at least from 3, where she was going to have some of the science information. She and CR were going to be the tech, basically the tech gods. I love this. I always had this concept that we were just going to kill Phalis off like David, Kirk's son in Star Trek 3, but he keeps coming back. Though the actual stabbing scene was Doug's. Mine was he just comes back. Doug reacts like Kirk does. You killed my flunky. You cyclone bastards. The funny thing is, I never laugh at the scene at first until Phalis starts talking after the guy keeps getting up and leaving. It's Orlando doing the stabbing very effectively. and it gets me every time. Like my favorite bits are just like, oh, that really hurts, and he's just like, well, that wasn't so, but ah, when he gets stabbed in the eye. But the best is when he walks away and he's just like, okay, I'm dead now, and then just says, oh, I probably shouldn't have said that. I think it was that one. Yeah, what you're looking at there is actually their reaction shots are four Omni lights to light their faces and then green around them. Again, not perfect, but just well enough to get the job done. In this, there's no ambient red lighting here. We use no gels. I wanted Doug to, but he didn't, so I had to in post kind of add these red battle lights, which kind of gives it this red glow. Here's the only problem with the battle lights. So look fine there. Upper right corner, when you see Phaelus' face, you'll see how red he is, and it's just, yeah, that just doesn't look right. But again, I was hampered by time. I, I love that read. Some less easy to resurrect. Here's what I don't understand is, again, this plays into the whole the villains or the villains acting on the critics will always be in their own kind of movie that's more about quoting the original source material. But nobody had a problem with the Star Trek 2 stuff here. Everybody complained about the Star Wars stuff. Everybody complained about Ghostbusters, but this stuff, no. And I'm like, there's a lot of direct ripping going on here. And you know, I don't know if nobody noticed or nobody cared, but like for some reason this whole scene got a pass. Maybe it's because it was exciting and they're like, ooh, battle, like, but yeah, we spoofed a lot of Trek here. Engineering was another tough one to light because the original shots they had a problem of everybody's faces were underlit and kind of bland, and the wall was so bright that it just completely overshadowed their faces. So I had to color correct all of the engineering stuff, beginning to end, and that's one of the few things you'll see on the DVD as kind of our redux is I didn't get to correct in the first part, but I was able to correct it later for the DVD. But yeah, a lot of that was tricky because I had to put Omni lights on their faces and then try to balance out the background. And the only thing it does, which looks a little goofy, is it does make CR's face in particular look kind of plasticine, like he's Lieutenant Commander Data. But with the visor, I think it looks kind of cool, so I'm not minding it that much. But again, if I were a professional, you know, I would have been able to do it right, but we had a limited time. I love this. Doug came up with this concept, and I think it's brilliant. This whole scene, I wrote the entire surprise attack, and then after the surprise attack is officially where my writing kind of died off a bit because I'm like, I don't have anything after that. So many things got changed because of losing Bargo and going to Washington that it was difficult. So I'm just like, come up with something, Doug. And again, there were pros and cons. The pros are, I think that the beaming scenes are brilliant, and some of the best slapstick. This, I'm not gonna lie, I'm not as much of a fan of. I think it would have worked in short bursts. Pardon the pun with the guns, but I kind of think it goes on too long. I kind of told Doug that in the script, and when I was watching the final cut of the film, he really was adamant about not cutting it, and I never... It's not like the Flight of the Navigator sequence where I could secretly go in and kind of do it, because I was already working on that, but he kind of insisted on keeping everything there as is, so... some people like it. I love the beaming stuff, and I love pieces of it. But as a whole, I think it goes on too long. For me, the honestly the most difficult parts of the movie are the middle. It just kind of gets lost. I couldn't save it. I don't think Doug could save it. I think that was the problem once we decided to invite so many people and had so many things change that you have to get all of these plots working somehow in the middle, so... I think the other thing that kind of bugs me about this scene is, for me, the plot just stops. pretty much the second Doug puts the Dread outfit on. There is no plot. It just here's like a 15-minute action sequence. And it was necessary to have action, though. I kind of argued that the battle on the bridge, the special effects there, kind of sold that, and we were okay. But you still need some little more action than that. And I thought that the beaming scene worked, and I love that. And I thought the concept of going outside worked because we needed to get out of that crazy. Crazy bridge, of just being so claustrophobic. So going outside didn't bother me. But the length of which we were out there in that field for that sequence, I think, in my opinion, went on too long. Maybe I'm wrong. I don't know. But the interesting thing, originally, I wanted Doug to shoot this more in spring so that we could add like a purple sky effect, so it didn't obviously look as much like Earth. But we did have that line, which unfortunately was more of a throwaway line, but was a throwback to the original script about there's life signs all over Europa, that the plot hole brings it back. I don't think we played that up enough, but... Well, we can steam their faces to death. Yeah, I had to light Phaelus because he was underlit there. And Mars, yeah, Marsgore was really underlit there. So the Omni lights came in handy for just bringing people's faces up because there was no... They had to move so fast in doing the lights that there was no way to make it perfect. So there were some scenes where people were just in shadows. So I'm just like, all right, I guess I'll just relight this in post now. And that is Doug as Gort. At least I think it's Doug. Yeah, the nerd, James Rolfe, could not come out. It's one of my favorite shots. Yeah, it's funny I say I don't like this sequence, but I actually shot all of it. But, yeah, the cinematography's nice, and it's nice to get some green and blue in there, but I don't know. I lose things to say even in this sequence. Like, I guess I could talk about the original idea behind the script was that they go to Europa, was just Otaku and more of a straight role as Savick. Sage, maybe, I think, and Phaelus, and they find Bargo's body. Just wandering around sort of empty-headed without a brain. At the same time, Mati's character is in Spoonie. So the concept was we have to get these two together and reunite them. Well, the thing is, it's a gatekeeper keymaster thing because the idea was he wants to be reunited, but it's actually a bad thing. The concept was that reuniting them was an awful idea because what had happened was Bargo's body was housing, or Mati's body was housing all of Mati's negative energy. Kind of like the plot hole is in this story. And that Spoonie was housing Mati's character, which was his good energy. But when you remove the character, the good energy, there's nothing left but the negative energy, which is Mati's dark side, the side that's pissed off about the fact that he's been used all the time and his character is useless. So the concept originally was there was going to be this big battle in Spoonie's mind. And it was going to be this dark Mati, who was originally supposed to be the one dressed up as Akira, versus Filmbrain and maybe Sage. And they kind of fight for Mati's soul. But we lost Bargo. And people who complain that are just like, oh, you couldn't even get Bargo back. You couldn't. I asked him. During the buyout, I'm like, please stay. I'm like, I'm writing this for you, and it's a great payoff for the character. You complain the character is kind of useless, but it's like, you're gonna be, you're gonna have this really badass character now, and there's gonna be a dark Mati, and it's gonna be a fight for Mati's soul, and you'll get to really toss the producers around and like shoot things with your eyes and have all these Akira powers, and like it's a great dramatic role. And Bargo just wasn't interested. He's like, I'm sorry, Robert, I need to move off to brighter and better things in the future. And I have no clue what he's doing now, but yeah, he wouldn't do it. I practically begged, and he said no. So there was nothing we could do. We got pigeonholed into doing the voice ourselves. It was either that or not have Mati at all. But I'm like, well, we have this footage from last year. We have these ideas. It seemed kind of dumb not to do it at all. So we came up with the idea of just making Mati the plot hole. And we retained some of it. But yeah, that was the original plot. And Europa played a much more huge role in it because it was going to be crumbling like the Genesis planet. And that was the concept that, even Luke was going to try to explain to the Emperor or the Executor that it's not working. You're not going to have control of anything. It's going to blow everything up. And, he didn't care. He was so drunk on his own power that he couldn't see the reality behind it. I guess he was kind of like a global warming denier or something. I don't know. I guess the thing about Europa was an inconvenient truth to him. But that's basically where we were going with all this. And the middle part of the movie was dealing with that, was finding Bargo's body, was figuring out the mystery behind Europa. It was actually more about a mystery behind Europa because we didn't have the love triangle. We didn't have, these extraneous things. I wasn't going to include them, and it was going to be a smaller cast. So it was based around that idea, and then, the Brad sort of Star Wars plot running concurrently, and then those two plots were going to meet. But yeah, losing Bargo, we didn't get to do any of that, so it definitely was different. And I mean, there were nods to Star Trek 3 where they find like a wheat field, and it's like, oh, it must be the oatmeal. It regenerated. I was even debating whether to pick up get like a giant oatmeal prop, like this giant grain of oatmeal that they pick up, like, oh, it's been regenerated, this and that. But then it decays and crumbles or something, and so finally the action scene's over. Okay. Love the payoff here, though. The SmackDown is great. And I love Turl beaming in. And I should say, I guess the thing about the action scene is it reminds me a lot of Fantasia 2000. A lot of people are like, how can you not like that movie? It's great. And as I explain to people, it's not that I hate the movie. And because they'll be like, oh, well, the scene with the whales. Oh, the this scene and that scene, and it's all so good. I'm just like, as I try to say, here's my problem. Individually, each scene in Fantasia 2000 is great. Just like individually, each joke, I think, in the action scene is great. Somehow, it doesn't work as a whole. It's just too long. All the little bits are funny, but it just doesn't work cohesively. And I think that's my problem with it. It's like, the funny thing is, individually, I actually laugh at a lot of those scenes. And the beaming scenes I still think are brilliant, but it doesn't, for some reason, it just never quite gels with me. But I don't know. Maybe I just prefer plot. Like, action's never as much as my thing. At least not gunfights. I actually love space battle action. I just don't like gunfights that much. I had a blast writing this scene. My biggest concern is there was a little more with Brian in the earlier draft, but some of that got cut. He just comes back. I kind of thought, well, it's we can't keep cutting back to Brian. It's too confusing, and so unfortunately for him, some of his scenes got cut. Originally, this was Sage's scene. Because Sage generally has the reputation of being sort of the darker one. And he also became the counselor. So originally this was Sage's scene, but I forget what happened. We changed it to Film Brain. I do know there was a mix-up where Doug sent Sage home, because this is like 2 in the morning. I should probably talk about the fact that we kind of thought scheduling would be easier this year because we weren't working outside. Were we wrong? I think we lured ourselves into a false sense of confidence because it was another nod, I think, to the villains being in a separate movie. I had that line. It was like, "Am I in the right movie?" There I am. Probably about 15 pounds heavier than I am now. I actually put on weight for this role. Weight that I'm trying to drop still. I, uh, Originally I was talking to Spoonie about this actually. I visited him in Arizona and I was like, well, I should drop weight to make myself look like Ian McDiarmid from Return of the Jedi. And then the more I thought about it, I was like, no, actually, if I'm playing Chris Dodd, who was the senator I'm spoofing here, he's a rather portly fellow. Um, and the other thing is, Ian McDiarmid in the later movies, which are actually the prequels, is gotten older and is kind of a little more hefty. And yeah, I think the biggest thing for me is the more I was looking, I was like, what I wanted to do was Rush Limbaugh. I'm like, what am I going to go for here? I was like, because I can't quite get myself to look like Chris Dodd without killing myself. But I'm like, what can I pull off? And I was like, I know Rush Limbaugh had lost actually a little bit of weight. I remember seeing a picture of him in Time magazine, and he had this cigar, and he was just puffing on this cigar, and this trail of smoke was just leaving his mouth. And I'm like, you know what? Whatever he was doing in that picture, that's what I'm gonna look like. So he had his hair slicked back. He was kind of had gray hair, and this beautiful looking suit on. And that's basically what I went with. I wanted your classical fat cat cigar smoking, sort of Republican cliche type. You're cliche Republican. You're your Wall Street sort of like fat cat style Republican, which is ironic because Chris Dodd's actually a Democrat. Not really a good one in my opinion, but the problem is I just couldn't make myself look like him, and I think this played up the corporate aspect more, because when you think corporate, you really kind of do think automatically Republican. This this is Doug's ex-girlfriend. She was in the other film too. I, a lot of people had a problem with the scene. They're like, "Oh, I can't believe you're doing SOPA. It's just so tired. It's so old, so yesterday." I honestly don't know where they're coming from. I think they're out of their mind. For one, oh, this was a last minute addition. Originally, it was going to be images, and I couldn't find images of like real film equipment that didn't look kind of fakey. So I had this last minute idea. I'm like, why don't we just call our friends, just have them play your crew? And Doug actually liked that, so. I think I was going for Q here at the end of the Next Generation finale, where he kind of like, there's like a snake-like quality. He keeps like going over every shoulder. It's like, the noose is tightening around the critics. I kind of almost want to add these whooshy sound effects to it. But so many people complain about that, and all I can say is, too bad. If you think it's beating a dead horse and that SOPA's gone, joke's on you, pals. We went to Washington and basically got told by some senators that, well, you don't understand. The people financing these things are big donors. We literally got told this, more or less. And literally after SOPA died, there are still bills coming out. Right now, there's the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which basically is SOPA for the Pacific nations, of which the U.S. will take part in, and all the U.S. needs to do is sign on to it, and we have SOPA-like laws in this country now. ACTA was another one that we didn't even need congressional approval. President Obama just signed that away. And, I mean, that's one of the big things that bothered me is, like, I'm playing somebody that, for the sake of looking in character, looks like a douchebag Republican, but there were just as many douchebag Democrats trying to ram this thing through, and a lot of them Hollywood bought Democrats. So it it was really demoralizing sitting there in Washington, and like no matter who we went to, Republican or Democrat, they were really for it. They, and the biggest one was of course Lamar Smith, whose people we did talk to, and it was like talking to a wall. And pretty much he was funded by Hollywood, has not a clue about internet policy. I watched the hearings on SOPA beginning to end, and it was quite clear that he had no clue what he was talking about. He stacked the deck so that there was no official representative from the tech industry apart from some lowly Google PR lady who was in over her head. Because that's how it works. Congress can put these hearings together and they decide they want to ram something through. Well, we'll call in the experts. We'll call in all the people who agree with us, and then one witness for the defense, or for one witness for the opposing side. That's exactly what they did. It was basically a show trial. And yeah, so that's actually who I'm picking on when I went with lame R prick. It was Lamar Smith. The only thing is he was supposed to be a junior senator, but Doug, we were supposed to cut to a plaque somewhere on his desk that says that, but Doug never did that. So people were wondering, is he an agent? What is he in? The original joke was he's a junior senator who works like on the FCC commission or something, and completely though supersedes his power. In the original draft of the script, Doug actually one of the funny things in the original, I love that by the way, the cut to Todd. Be discreet, please. I'm a ninja. He did that exactly how I wanted him to. Like one of my other favorite lines that I put in there was, "Just want to turn you into a mindless automaton bent on serving our will." Isn't that a relationship? But in the earlier draft, Doug, instead of getting the engines from Insano, gets basically 2 nuclear-style missiles that he straps to the house that was going to have the thing kind of fly. And they ask, "Where'd you get that?" And he's like, "I conned some North Koreans out of it or something." And later, Prick finds out about this and basically orders his army men at Area 52 to declare war on North Korea. And the guy's like, "Sir, only the president has the authority to." And he's like, "Just do it!" So there's always this concept that he was this senator superseding his authority, which for me was very true to life. You've got somebody who has no clue how the internet works completely superseding his authority. And basically, in his attempt to basically kowtow to his corporate masters or basically shut down a pirate problem that's completely overstated, would have broken half the internet doing it. And completely gone against free speech, instituted new laws that basically would have made censorship way worse, would have made dealing with copyright law way worse. But it didn't matter, because that's what bothered us. In Washington, whether you were a Democrat or a Republican, free speech didn't matter. Well, we're getting paid by these guys. We have to do it. And it was really sad. So I had no problem bringing this up, because it's still going on. It will come back. It's coming back now, just not in its SOPA form, but people are still trying to ram it through. It's not an issue that's going to go away. So to the people that are just like, "Oh, I can't believe you did that. It's just, SOPA, just so old news. That is so March 2012. I'm like, tough luck. Don't care. I know I may sound bitter, but, you weren't sitting there lobbying these people, trying to get them to change their minds. And the only thing that did change their minds, by the way, was the blackout. Thank God for Wikipedia. I tip my hats to you, sirs, because they weren't going to listen to us. So we were there trying, but, the internet blackout that Wikipedia did is really what got them to shut down. Because they thought they could do it in secret. So... And honestly, I hope anybody watching this film will look up what the hell SOPA was and maybe pay a little more attention to what's going on, because they nearly got away with it. Had all of us not made a big deal about it, we would be sitting under SOPA now, and all of these people were just like, oh, I want to watch real reviews. I don't want to watch an anti-SOPA rant. Wouldn't be able to see their real reviews right now. You know, you could shut them down easily. So. But that's my 2 cents on the subject. I get really angry and bitter there. It's politics. How can you not get angry and bitter, folks? One of the best cuts ever is to film Brain there. Why do I have to do this? Sad Panda, he was a later addition, and I didn't know what to do with him. I was just told Sad Panda's coming now, and I'm just like, oh, crap. I didn't have a ton for Benzai, so it was an easier fix than I thought. We did lose Benzai's fan dance scene early on, which is his big moment, but I got the idea. Originally, Sage was supposed to be the Doctor, which made sense because he was the Doctor in Kick-Assia. I never liked making him the counselor, and I did kind of think that our giving him whole psychic powers thing didn't really make much sense. It was kind of Doug's idea, but he was always supposed to be really concerned about Spoonie, and I think we did do just a good enough job of kind of giving him something to do. But so he originally was going to be the Doctor, but we made Sad Panda the Doctor, and I wrote him in the end as Dr. House from House MD. So that's where the painkillers joke came from. And he says, anything that House has taught me, it's always go for the insanely, complicated plan that I just came up with at the last second. If it doesn't work, it might kill the patient, which is always how House works. And then he says, painkillers? And I came up with the painkillers idea to try to explain how the hell is they survive without oxygen, because it's a long fight Doug put in there, so I was like, well, maybe the painkillers slowed their metabolism. This scene was pretty fun. I believe, actually, my original draft, I was even way more cruel to the critic in particular. Actually, I love more than anything her best Ed moment, Jess Otaku's, was that nom 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 and spooky. God, I hope this gets fixed on the DVD. It's not fixed now. Okay, here's what happened here. Jim and I were color correcting and going through this, and the hair was completely green. It was keyed all wrong because it was so frizzy to be like Sting. In our attempts to fix it, we basically we basically overkeyed it, and Spoonie became like the Rubber Man. Kind of looking like this 9-year-old white dude. And that was a mistake on our part. I take full responsibility. We meant to fix it, but didn't get around to it. And I've insisted to Doug, I'm like, fix it, dear God, fix it. We were just trying to fix Spoonie's hair to make it less green, and we overkeyed it, and it was not supposed to look like that. Look at all the furry porn. This was a scene that Jim relit, and it adds so much. Imagining what this scene looked like, imagine bright white lights. The scene was dark, but it was still lit with white lights, and it just looked like my attic. I thought Doug was going to shoot this in such a way that, it was my old living space back when Doug and I were in the early days doing work at our parents' place, and I thought for sure Doug was going to shoot this so you couldn't tell it was an attic, and instead it's like he shoots the door, which we could have had open. He gets the ugly brown carpeting and everything, and it does not look like a technological sort of office or a mini movie theater or something. This part looked better, but it was all of this sort of white. It was almost like a black and white scene. So Jim came in. I think this may have been the first thing he did. He's just like, well, we can relight this. And he threw in these red lights on our faces and this blue sort of light in the background. It completely remade the scene. I'm like so grateful to Jim for that. he pretty much saved this scene because I think it's a great scene. I love the idea of doing that scene from Sith, but reincorporating it so we're talking about Manos, but it has this devil deal with the devil quality. It's real Faustian. I've got more red on me, and then Brad's is kind of like thinking about it. And I really wanted to emulate kind of what they were doing in Sith, which it did have sort of a mysterious quality, even though they were watching fucking bubbles. Um, Again, it's a villain scene, and I had no problem doing this. It was always this big experiment, and Jim and I had this discussion. He's like, "Are you worried about that?" I'm like, "Well, people will either love it or hate it, and it's it's an experiment." I wanted to see. I'm like, can I write a movie? Can I write an original story, basically using nothing but scenes from other movies? Because there are story arcs beginning to end involving our characters. It was like, can I tell that through already established movies, like spoof the big scenes and basically be like, okay, well, there is going to be a turn here, but it's going to be Brad, and his story arc is going to be, he wants to become a better filmmaker, and this is, can it be done? And interesting thing, it totally can be done. Whether it should be done, maybe is the bigger question. I think we succeeded for what I wanted to do. Whether it was worth doing, I don't know. I mean, Gus Van Sant remade Psycho beginning to end. Interesting idea. Was it worth doing? Probably not. So I guess it just depends where you fall on that. I tried my best, but it's a little nod to Star Trek 1 there. I'm not gonna lie, I tried to throw as many references to sci-fi as I could, but I forget some of even I forget some of the things that were referenced until I see them. This was another thing, like, you want to know why the film was delayed? Imagine nothing but black behind that plot hole and black behind Film Brain. No smoke, just plot hole and Film Brain. And Film Brain, not really color corrected in any way to match, just kind of bland looking. It it just didn't look right, and I'm like, Doug, if we do a 3-day release schedule, I can fix these scenes. But since we're already releasing them now, I can't do it if it's every 2 days. I'll run out of time because we had a major wedding to go to, and we were going to be out for 4 days. So, it's like, no, we'll do that. Most hilarious thing is somebody's like, "Oh, it's just a money grab. You want to make more money?" And I'm like, "How? That doesn't even make any sense." The smarter thing to do would be make most money is release them close enough together to basically get like a good vibe going. You run the risk the longer you release it that people will just lose interest and drop off. So it really wasn't for that. It was just to get the film looking right. Yeah, here's another one. Like, this scene was completely relit. So it actually looks kind of like creepy and ethereal now. There's an Omni light on Brian's face, on my faces. We did ambient lighting for the lightsabers so that everything has a glow. And that was Jim. Especially chipwrecked. My acting style, I guess you could say, for the character, at least for the Claude part, was Ian McDiarmid in the Star Wars prequels playing Palpatine. I watched him a lot and tried to figure out kind of how he was doing it. The other thing I kept doing was, oh God, this is so painful for me to watch. I just abandoned all shame. I was like making silly faces because it's such a silly scene in Sith. I'm sorry though. He's killing me. So I was trying to emulate that, but it is one of the better scenes in Sith, though. Despite that, like it actually comes off as pretty cool. But that's one of the things that I did take pride in doing is we ripped a lot of Star Wars off, but we didn't pick on as many of the obvious things. Like, a lot of the stuff we spoof, like everything, "Oh, I can't believe you're doing Star Wars. I've seen these jokes before." Where? Family Guy did not do the prequels. And a lot of the scenes we picked on were actually the good scenes. We didn't throw. Doug wanted to throw a Jar Jar character into this movie. I voted him down. I was desperate not to do that. Um, so it. I love that. So yeah, I we picked on a lot of the scenes that actually were some of the big moments, like some of the cool scenes, which was sort of our tribute. It wasn't just about plagiarizing them. It was I wanted to make fun of it, but also to kind of like say, hey, we really enjoy these things. You know, let's kind of do them and have fun with them, and tell our own story within that framework. That we did make fun of it here. I that was always my problem with Sith. Just Anakin turns on a dime. I that line goes back to the original draft. It's like, really, that was faster than I expected. I have a real impulse control problem. Apparently. This scene here is so underlit because it was 90 to 100 degrees up there. And poor Haley did not know that I was going to take the robe off for one scene. So she put our makeup girl was Haley, and she did a spectacular job. But she put this latex forehead on, which I did want. She tried this whole other latex facing, and we had to ditch it because I looked a little too angular, and with it so humid up there, pieces kept falling off, which delayed shooting that night, unfortunately. We ended up there so late. It was like 4 in the morning when we left. But this scene, by the way, did not work until I added jazz music. It was originally quiet. Another thing I should let you know is I got so busy because Holly could not make it the first few days she was in the hospital having her gallbladder removed that I basically ended up pitching in a lot of line producing things I wasn't expecting to do. So I had none of my lines memorized. I showed up on set doing a lot of these things, not remembering my lines. And so a lot of it was kind of improvised. I remember kind of what I said, but like that one there was improvised. I think you can tell it's not my best work. The worst was sitting down and doing the Mano scene because I thought that at least was being filmed later, that I didn't need to be seated next to Brad. And in reality, I didn't, because I don't think there's that many scenes with Brad and I together there. But Doug's like, no, we're doing it tonight. I just panicked. It was white knuckle filmmaking at its best because I sat facing forward having just looked at the whole paragraph like a minute before and just tried my best to remember it. I actually like the way this worked. I think Doug got it. I was like, in the end, I'm like, we need to go kind of for a Dark City montage of like reestablish some sense of momentum here. So that's my problem. I think the weakest part of the movie is actually the middle part. The dream sequence stuff is kind of interesting and funny, but it is slow and draggy. The Robotod stuff, funny but slow and draggy. The fight, it wasn't really one of our best choreographed fights. Like there is a slowness to this whole section that's not helped by the fact that we're stuck in this room. We're kind of stuck on the bridge. So anything to do to get the momentum back. God, Doug's original image for this was just some Dutch computer program or something, or some language, and I'm like, Doug, this is just some error screen in Dutch. And he's like, yeah, what's the problem? I'm like, you realize we have people on the site who are Dutch, or not on the site, but who visit the site in the Netherlands, and people who speak German. You know, the languages are close enough, you may be able to pick up. He's like, oh, what's the matter? I'm like, you can't say the oxygen's dropping, or you can't say this is a timeline of communications, and then that's actually my voice doing George Takei. Oh my. I'll talk about that in a second, but I was like, you can't just cut to some Dutch error screen and claim it's a timeline of who's talking to who. I mean, it's just a Dutch error screen. He's like, oh, no, we don't know, nobody cares. That is the only thing where it's like, once again, it's Brian's. It's like, Doug sometimes misses the little details, because I'm like, well, I think anyone who speaks Dutch or anybody who's looking at that, like, why is it in a foreign language will care. This lens flare I put in for the DVD, and it was the first time Doug's like, all right, that looks really cool. It literally was just something to make the scene look a little bit cooler, because we, the fight's kind of slow, so... And the fact that the light was on in the background, I just thought, oh, well, I'll just turn this on and see what happens. So I just flew it back in there, and it was an easy thing to do, and I just turned it on and off as she walked in front of it, so... This... Okay, so Juwario. Juwario was one of the last ones to have a story arc. He was the navigator. So he was supposed to, basically fly the ship. And he was written vaguely like Sulu, but nothing intense. He didn't really have a big moment, and Doug cut most of the scenes out where I was kind of making fun of Mario Kart and giving Juwario stuff. Doug, early on, was obsessed with costumes. And I don't know what it is. Doug has a costume fetish. It's the only way I can describe it. That scene where Allison was punching Lindsay was so poorly color corrected, but her face literally was practically black. It was in the shadows, so I had to turn it up to insane amounts. And for this scene, I actually did adjust some of the color correction, so it's a little more of a blue tinge. Which made Robotodd's costume come out a little more, look a little more metallic. Gave it a little bit more of a fight scene quality, too. Everything's a little more polished in this scene. But Doug, so yeah, I was writing the movie. I'm like, we're going to do a real movie, we're going to do this. And my biggest thing, that was one of the things I put in reasons Suburban Nights didn't work, too many costumes. With no justification. It's like, we're going to dress in costumes, just because. So I was adamant on not doing that. And Doug's just like, no, everybody's in costumes. And I'm like, we can't do this. He's like, no, it'll be funny. Mickey will be dressed up as Mega Man throughout the whole thing. I'm thinking of making, and that was another last minute effect. Giving him the red glow. I just did that for shits and giggles. I said, I said, no, we can't do that. And Doug goes, no, we'll do that. And we'll have Allison dress up as Samus Aran for reasons I still will never understand. And Sad Panda still was coming to me like, what is this about? He's like, Sad Panda will be Optimus Prime. Though originally that was going to be Benzai. Benzai was going to be Optimus Prime. I'm like, why? They're on a bridge. Why do they need to dress like this? He's like, well, it's funnier that way. He kept saying, people expect it. People expect costumes. We have to do costumes. And that was probably the biggest fight or second biggest fight we had. I'm just like, no. I'm like, I am writing a serious movie here. Yes, it's a goofy movie. It's a comedy, but I'm not doing the costume thing again. If there's no reason. Everything has to work because the plot says so. Like, it has to fit within the confines of the plot. So unless there's a legitimate reason for them to be in costume, we're not doing it. As it stands, that's exactly what we did. Characters get assimilated. They wear a costume. Juwario basically takes his shirt off. Mechakara, that's a costume. The Executor, that's a costume. But it all works within the confines of the plot. So I finally convinced Doug not to do it. And thank God. I mean, I can't imagine 8-Bit Mickey, considering the time constraints we had, being dressed as Mega Man this entire movie. With no reasoning. Like, the closest reason I came to was, in the original draft, I put it in there only because Doug wanted it, but I'm like, what reason are we giving? Well, no, they'll just put costumes because it's a sci-fi thing. So I put in that Doug says, dress for outer space. And Doug comes back, and Doug's actually dressed in an astronaut outfit, like he's going to really go into space, and they're all dressed in all of these goofy sci-fi character outfits. And Doug says, what the hell? I said dress for space. And one of them says, all we know about sci-fi movies we just got, or no, all we know about space we learned from sci-fi movies. So that was the reason they were going to be in costumes like that, is because they simply got all of their information from sci-fi films. And that was the best justification I could come up with. I had nothing else. It would have been impossible to give a justification for 30 separate costumes. The only compromise I had was I did say, Doug, if you want to put them all in Star Trek uniforms, that at least makes sense. But he didn't do that, and I don't mind. It kind of gives them all character to be dressed in what they're normally wearing. The whole Mecha Kara thing. Well, I should say Juwario. So anyway, the thing about Juwario is Doug wanted costumes, and at the last second he says, "I know what we're gonna do with Juwario." I'm like, "Okay, what?" He's just like, "We're gonna make him. He's gonna come out spontaneously and attack Mecha Kara with his shirt off like George Takei." I was against it initially. I'm like, "Are you?" He told me this at the airport when I was on my way actually to help Spoonie film something in Arizona. I'm like, "Are you out of your mind?" He's like, "What?" He's just like, "What connection does that have to the rest of the plot?" Well, it's just funny. It'll be funny. I'm like, but it has nothing to do with the rest of the plot. And he's like, well, I don't think it matters. I don't think that. I'm like, no, 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 it does. So I I told him originally I was against it, but the more I thought of it, I was like, well, it is a pretty funny idea. So I ended up actually reverse engineering it. I retconned the rest of Juwario's scenes to get the Tao Takei stuff in there. And I called Doug back. I'm like, all right, we'll do this, but we're going to make him a student of George Takei. And I'm going to make this fake Tao Takei book and kind of throw in our jokes in that way, and which is fun because I'm a huge George Takei fan. I think the guy is awesome, so it was fun to sort of give him stuff to do. That was George Takei related. So yeah, that actually came first, the finale there, and then we wrote backwards from that. This is one of my favorite routines. Because it drowned in the coffee. Another interesting twist on the original idea, we were going to go with Film Brain as the Darth Vader character. It just slowly morphed out of that because we're like, well, we did Luke and Film Brain at first. It made more sense early on because Luke and Film Brain were the young characters and it was all about fighting for souls. And it was like, well, you got the two young characters fighting each other and this and that. But as we moved on and did the plot hole bit with Matisse stuck in there and Film Brain, it made more sense to do that. Okay, that was one thing we had to reference, and I'm sure that joke's been done before, the no, but how can you not? Um, but it made more sense to have Film Brain sort of go off and help my tea, and it made more sense because they're both the lackeys. We couldn't have Cinema Snob or someone else do it. We had to have the two lackeys together, and then I had this idea of, a younger critic looking up to an older critic, so you have Luke and Brad. And it made more sense to do Brad. We had some companies that go, yeah, let's pick the best actor and put him in a mask. Yeah, that's brilliant. But I think it really works because Brad's the only one who can carry it off with that voice. And it's also funnier to see Brad in that suit and just looking kind of goofy with a mask on, but hearing that voice coming out of it. And it also fit in with the plot that we were working with, which is Brad goes through this sort of transformation of kind of just turning and wanting to become a corporate sellout, and he was the only one we could make that plot work for because he's done other projects on the side. No other producer, maybe Lindsay, but no other producer to the degree that Brad keeps doing it or trying to do it has done that many movies on the side. So you could argue that Brad wants to branch out and kind of do his own thing, and it fit within the constructs of that plot. I love that bit. My one favorite line is Brian saying, "Oh, Luke, nothing's impossible. You just have to swallow your humanity, take a molten laser sword, and ram it down your best friend's throat. It's the only civilized way." And I was spoofing the scarred line from Sit There. There was something about the way Ian McDiarmid said "scarred" in that scene that always drove me nuts. He's talking to someone. He's like, "My battle with the Jedi's have be scarred." And he goes on forever, and I'm just like, if you don't want to look evil, you're not making your case well when you quote lines like that. Scarred. So, if I did have maybe one regret, like I think some of these throwaway lines of like, "It is of no use," "It is of no concern. The snob is now one of us." I probably could have dropped those. They don't. They get repetitive. If I was going to retool it a bit, I would probably do that. Oh, Owen Citizen. Yeah, Kyle was a last minute addition. Um, we didn't know if he could come to Chicago for this because he had grad school and stuff, but he was somebody I did want. There was a list of people I did want, and definitely Jess Otaku, CR, and Kyle were among them. We couldn't invite everybody, so they ended up being the top three that kind of edged a few other people out, but that was always a joke from the beginning when I wrote the script that he was just going to plop Yoda ears on. When I was first writing the script, I was like, well, how am I going to do this training sequence? Like, there'll have to be a training montage, I guess, but it was taking so long. I'm like, we can't spoof Empire here. I'm like, at least not to the degree that they do. It's like, there has to be a quick way to do this. And for whatever reason, I don't remember when or where I came up with it, but I was like, you know what? Dark City style montage. He'll do something to Luke, and we'll do that montage where Kiefer Sutherland is talking to Rufus Sewell and giving him all the instructions. Never talk to strangers, John. Remember, the world can be what you make of it. Um, and, and that's where the joke comes from. Alex Proyasak, a lifetime of training in a single syringe, which is a line from the actual montage in the movie. Um, it this scene, there are lines I'm proud of. There are jokes I'm proud of, but I mean, honestly, as a whole, I'm not proud of this. I'm like, I make no bones about it. We're making silly, goofy movies, and I take it seriously to try to do the best product I can. But like, it's still goofy, and some of my jokes suck, and this and that, and This scene, though, I will say this is probably my favorite scene, just because it was the one thing that was untouched by the rest of the film. Doug never touched a word on this. It was never touched by the fact that we had to bring more producers in or that we had to tell goofy jokes or had to do something comedic. There's nothing really comedic about this scene. You can argue that maybe the Rob Schneider line's kind of funny, but honestly, for me, it's just the truth. But I don't know. It was just a very important scene for me to write because I think more than any other scene in the film, this is pretty much my thoughts on film just dumped onto the page and then dumped into the movie without any other interference or distractions. It's just like, here's my thoughts on film. Here's my thoughts on, what art kind of is and really why, even though what we do is goofy, like why critics are important. And why, even though critics are here to kind of rip some things to shreds, like why art can still affect you even otherwise. Like there are films I admit are not the best, but they still get me somewhere. And if they have a moment like that, I still like them. But I worked really hard on that scene to get the music right. Doug originally had Tannhäuser, which is at the end here throughout the whole thing, and it just wasn't clicking with me. I wanted something more film score-ish and something that really kind of bridged that gap between celluloid and music and kind of worked as a whole. And Doug eventually did go with my version. Doug, the funny thing is when I originally wrote it, it was supposed to be like Dark City, so it definitely had more of a like sort of an impact of like, let's get the momentum going. We're going to be whoosh sound effects and whoosh, whoosh, and it's like, but never forget this, never forget that. And he shot it completely the opposite of how I imagined. And I wasn't disappointed at all. I'm just like, well, I didn't think of it that way. And once I saw what he did with it, I'm like, wow, this is actually really gorgeous. He really made the scene better by doing that. So kudos to him. I really. Here's the funny thing: for as much as Doug complained, Doug wanted costumes, I really wanted Mars Girl to be dressed as Mon Mothma. Um, and I was gonna call her Mars Mothma, actually. Doug would not budge, and he's like, absolutely not. We can't do that. And I said, okay, why not? He's like, doesn't make any sense. I think I may have like dropped my jaw. I was like, really? After all of this talk about costumes, that's your reasoning for what? I was like, and I do remember bringing out the fact, I'm like, Doug, you dress up as Judge Dredd for no other reason than you just want to dress up as Judge Dredd. Because he has that line about, like, I want to wear my battle armor, but I'm like, why does your battle armor look like Judge Dredd? Why does it? His only excuse is, why would the critic not have Judge Dredd battle armor? And I'm like, well, I guess when you argue with logic like that. But he, no, he just would not do it. And, like, I know on with some of the other commentaries, people were saying, it's like, oh, I wish she was dressed as Mon Mothma. And I, like, grabbed my hair and, because that's what I wanted to do. But she apparently studied the scene to get the scene down, right? And she delivered it so well, particularly the many Bothans died to bring us this information, which was something that both Doug and I, like, really enjoyed. I was like, Doug, I think I'm going to have this running joke with the Bothans. And there were cut scenes because in the original draft, I know Luke was going to go with, they were going to take a shuttlecraft and we are going to spoof that scene where they kind of sneak past the Armada. And then Luke was going to beam them over. And there was some conversation on the shuttlecraft about how Joe's like, you forgot about the Bothans again. And he's like, what is your deal with the Bothans anyway? He's like, my dad was half Bothan. So he's like, I thought your name, his last name was Vargas. He's like, Joe Vargas is my slave name. My real name is Hiawatha. So something like that. That was another lighting correction I did. I really wanted this to kind of look like that, like a battle scene, like, basically doing the whole battle plans, like with the one light on them and darkness around them. So the only problem is I didn't want to do it throughout the whole scene, so I couldn't find it out. And then Phelan explodes. I'm like, oh, I'll just claim that's the out. The lights kind of come back on after he explodes, so. I tend to look at that scene as Doug. Oh, fantastic effect. It's actually one of my favorites in the film. Trokin and our team did such a good job. I actually wrote the Morbin Tabernacle choir line and the Amish funeral. I wrote both of those thinking Doug would cut one and use the other, and he actually used both of them. This is always an idea. For some reason, the early draft of the script had this kind of like a big Hollywood Coke party, and they just have Coca-Cola. Bit of a pause here. Yeah, that was it. Okay, that was a moment when he's like, I'm offended. And I'm like, what? I don't know why. Yeah, turn the bad lights back on here because they're going to go into battle soon, so. The interesting thing is I tried turning the red lights down because I'm like, wow, Mickey's hand is so red. It must be a color correction error on my part. Turns out it was the blood from earlier. He couldn't scrub all of it off. I'm like, oh, I can't fix that. Oh, but that scene earlier, I tend to think of it that the critic knows what he's going... I think he's thinking about what he's going to do. I think he has sort of an idea, like, maybe I should go, but he hasn't made up his mind yet. But he's sitting there thinking about it. It's obvious that somewhere between he made up his mind. This scene was very important to me. Doug kept kind of rewriting it a little, and I really tried to fight to keep it as it was. I think Doug's worry was he thought it was too mean to the critic. I don't know if Doug just doesn't want to attack the critic, but I'm like, no, let's be honest with ourselves, Doug. The critic falls on a lot of tropes. We've done a lot of things in the films. Fans haven't. It's like, let's do this. And his big thing was like, you can't say I'm not a real critic. And I don't know why, because we've always argued that we're entertainers first. and critics second. And I really wanted to make that distinction. That I think part of it is Doug's characters realizing is like, he cuts some lines about all I do is destroy people's childhoods, which there's some truth in that. I know so many people who've just like, oh, I used to love that movie until you show me how bad it was. And that first time I heard that, I was kind of sad. I'm like, wow, that's kind of sad. Like, I don't want to destroy people's films that they liked as a kid. Like, but it was basically I tried to take all of the negative things about the nostalgia critic, both fictional and real. The fact that we do gloss over some things for the sake of a joke. The fact that we do sometimes destroy people's childhoods and or what they remember about the film as being good. And also fictional things, the fact that the character's a jerk and this and that, and put them all here and really just tear Film Brain down. That was the whole thing. This is Film Brain's story arc of like, it was important to me is like Film Brain has to be torn down to rock bottom and basically sort of come into his own from this point on. He's been worshiping the critic, and now he is facing the fact that his hero just, seems to be walking out on him, and, the critic really isn't. The critic's sort of doing this as a bit of a dodge, basically telling... It's that scene where you kick the puppy and tell the puppy, go away to save the puppy. Like, I can't keep you anymore. You have to go. Go home, boy. That's kind of what Doug is doing to Film Brain. But, and he plays it kind of like this, kind of a puppy-like quality. And Doug wanted to cut this scene. There were about maybe 4 scenes that Doug wanted to cut. Out of all the things Doug cut, I argued for 4 that should stay in. This was another one of them. It was very important to me to have this sort of quiet, mystical moment where Film Brain and Luke reconcile with each other and where Luke says straight up, listen, I know the critics turned his back on you, but if I don't make it back, you may be the only hope. Like, you have to watch Sweeney, you have to do this, because the point is he has hit rock bottom, and I think he needs a little bit of a pick-me-up here. Like, he needs to have some faith restored. And the joke of it is, so many people missed the joke, that the joke is actually saying, you need to trust yourself after you trust us first. But if we fail, then trust yourselves. There's still this concept of, like, Film Brain's still sort of a fuck-up character, and they don't totally trust him, but they trust him more. Hardest scene to color correct was this one, because I had to throw a spot in the background, but I also had to, like, relight everything, and initially it kind of looks fake, but I think it works overall. But I mean, again, that was just bright sort of white light. I really wanted to tone the scene down and make it darker and more ambient, kind of like a real movie. One of God, they do that well. Originally, I think Ed Glazer was going to be Non. And this whole idea came from... Doug had this idea way back when he was doing the conventions. Because he had the Zod outfit. He's like, Lindsay looks enough like Ursa. If we could get Ed Glazer or somebody else, to play Non, we could do, or I could find one of my other friends at the conventions. We should totally do that. And he wound up putting a lot of it into this. But, one of the earlier jokes that got cut, I guess I'll talk about the other giant argument we had. The two biggest arguments we had. First was costumes. And then the arguments we had about cutting, I call them arguments, but I don't, there was nothing mean-spirited about them. There was nothing tense in the sense that you may, pardon me, I'm like drinking water here as I'm trying to do this. You may, this could kill the film. Like, no way, I'm not letting this happen. This is not happening so the cut stuff for the most part, there was one scene that I did argue this may kill the film if you cut it. But, the other ones were more arguments about, like, no, I think it's really, really important to have this. And the other cuts, as I said, I didn't care. So the only 2 arguments that were really tense was the costumes first and foremost. I said, no costumes, absolutely not. The second argument actually had to do with J.O.'s character, because I wrote her as a straight character originally. Actually, apparently I get rumor down the grapevine that that is my most the line the producers quote the most from me. Apparently, it's their favorite. I thought I told you to get an egg McMuffin. And I'm losing my voice here. This commentary's going on and on. Um, and this was a quick fix because originally I had it where Luke beams onto the death bomb. He was going to come in a shuttlecraft, and Doug's like, "This scene's too long. We need to cut it." And I'm like, "That's fine, but how does Luke get there?" And somewhere spontaneously, I had this idea. You know what? We'll just he'll come to you. He'll come to me. Yeah. How do you know? He's standing right next to you. Poof. Done. But J.O.'s character was a straight character. Funny enough, but not haha funny. She was gonna be like Donatello. You know, CR was she was actually I modeled her off of Gadget from Chippendale's Rescue Rangers. So she was always going to be kind of perky like Ed was, but I modeled her basically off of Gadget's character from Rescue Rangers, Tech Girl. You know, she invents all the stuff. You know, does that sort of thing. You know, fairly bright. And then CR was going to be modeled more off of like Donatello, off the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, and they were going to be her two tech people. And then her middle role was going to be kind of Savick like, you know, dispensing advice. Well, Doug wanted to do Ed, and I was having a heart attack because I'm like, Doug, you realize there's about 50% of the population that hates that character. That when you watch Cowboy Bebop, I know people that have turned off the show the second they saw Ed and never finished it. I mean, I like Ed as a character on Cowboy Bebop, but, you know, there are many people who don't. And I was like, and remember, we just did an anime character last year, and Mars Girl got her ass handed to her. Like, a lot of people didn't like it. And I'm like, this is the first time we're bringing J.O. to something. We don't know if we're doing crossovers anymore. We don't know if, you know, there'll be another anniversary film. Do we want to create a lot of bad blood already? And he's like, it'll be fine. It'll be fine. And, you know, I just was so scared. I'm like, and I was like, and keep in mind, the other thing is, we have no idea if she can do it. I mean, this came down to basically just like with Lindsay doing Sarah Palin in Kick-Assia, we had no clue till the moment we said action how good her Ed was going to be. And I had no... It's not that I had no faith that she could do it. I mean, she obviously really can do it and did it well. I just had no idea, though. I'm just like, this is a big mystery. We have no idea if she can pull it off. Half the people out there hate Ed to begin with. And I was actually convinced through erroneous information that she hated Ed as a character. It turns out it's not her, it's someone else on the site. It may have actually been Nash or something, but for some reason I was under the impression she hated Ed. So I was just arguing against this, and then Doug's like... Doug takes the scenes that I had written straight and then makes them completely goofy. I'm like, all right, well, at least she's inventing stuff. But my argument still was just like, it was such a shoehorned in plot device. It was like, oh, well, you know, she gets zapped by something and turns into Ed. It was better when we came up with the idea of the dream device kind of does it, but originally it was just, she gets zapped by something. I'm like, oh my god, this is like, you know, this seems really sort of manufactured, but all right. But all of her scenes became goofy, and I was like, all right, we'll do that. But I added at the end that her entire story arc was based around the fact that she was not as good of an inventor as CR. That her stuff kind of blows up occasionally and this and that. And, you know, she always had this sort of thing like, golly, you know. But, you know, in the end, her thing was always about faith. That she didn't have faith in herself, much like Film Brain. There was going to be sort of a connection between her and Film Brain and Luke. The three of them, and he was going to be like, well... you know, they say, no, you can do this. You can build this blue shell. You know, Luke mentions, originally the conversation was supposed to be Luke and her, and Luke mentions to her, you know, you may be able to save us all. You know, you just have faith in yourself that you can do what it is you need to do. And it was going to be building the blue shell. Well, Doug took that scene and replaced it with, well, she gets changed back to normal and then she's an idiot. I just had a heart attack because I'm like, Doug, we just took another smart female character and just completely turned her into a dunce again, which is what we did in Suburban Nights. It's kind of what we did in Kick-Assia with the Sarah Palin character. You know, I know we didn't do much of a service to Allison by making her Snow White in Suburban Nights. I'm like, can we just have can we just, you know, not do that with the character? And he's like, well... he's like, I don't know. If you got something better, come up with it. So at the last second, I came up with the idea that she figures out that whatever she says, if what she was doing was correct, then whatever she's doing now is wrong. Then just do the opposite of what she says. So she still has some part in it. But she was just going to disappear and not build the blue shell at all. And I was like, that seems unfair being the inventor just to take her out of it. I was like, no, she needs to be there helping to build it. It just makes sense. So we ended up doing that, but it was this huge argument about what we were going to do with her character. Well, the funny thing is, flash forward like about a month later after having this discussion, and a couple things happened. First, I talked to Jo, and Jo was like, oh, I just wanted to say I saw the script, and I'm so glad you didn't make me a straight character, because I rather would do comedy and straight characters. I'm not good at drama. I'm uncomfortable doing it and this and that, and she's like, oh, and thank you for making it Ed. I love Ed. And I was like, well, that's funny. I thought you hated it. He's like, no, 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 no. You're thinking of this person. I was like, oh, and I was like, I didn't realize you hated doing drama. He's like, no, I love comedy so much better. I mean, my stuff, you probably would have wanted to write it like all dramatic and stuff because my character is so normal in my reviews, but secretly I really love doing comedy. And I was like, oh, good to know. And I like went back to Doug and plopped down a Coca-Cola on his table. And I was like, well, Doug, I owe you a Coke. It's just like, wow, was I wrong? I was like, no, you were completely right. And, the only interesting thing out of it is, oh, God. Okay, so that scene, Doug did not want to have a space battle. He was adamant. He's like, we can't have a bunch of ships. I'm like, well, we have to have an armada to make your distraction scene work. He's like, I know. So one day I was playing Modern Warfare 3. And when you play the beginning of the game, there's an early mission where you sneak aboard a battleship and change the nuclear launch codes or the missile launch codes so that they fire on the enemy ships only. And I remember playing that and I was like, that's the most hilarious thing I've ever seen. And I was like, you know what? I'm just going to totally throw that in the movie. That's just funny. So I can't claim credit for that one. That was Modern Warfare 3. It's like one of the early missions in the game, but this scene I had trouble color correcting. I couldn't figure out how to stop his lips from glowing red because I wanted the room red, but it also turned his lips red. So Matt kind of looks like he's got too much Joan Crawford makeup on. I don't know. He kind of had that problem in the whole shoot. Even in scenes I didn't color correct, he's got really red lips. I don't know why. Was I. But so we ended up shooting it with Ed, and a lot of the things I had troubles with, Doug and I were able to work out together. So, and in the end, I think it works. There was a backlash, but it wasn't gargantuan, and it wasn't as high as 50%. So I'd say about a quarter of people were really kind of just like, I don't like this, but I think enough people liked it that it worked. And was her plot thread way less interesting than what I originally had? Yeah. Was it funnier? Hell yeah. It was way, way funnier. So if the idea was to make it more comedic, it definitely worked. And the scenes with Film Brain and the critic and stuff, I think kind of make up for that anyway. Like, I think we had enough drama. Check that camera for more dramatic effect. But the distraction song actually was another scene that kind of terrified me because I'm like, this is either going to really work or really not. Doug wrote the lyrics. It was Doug's idea to do a montage. I'm like, I liked it in theory. Okay, that is the only moment where I think I really did get Ian McDiarmid down. For some reason, when I say that one line, I'm like, wow, that's pretty damn close. Your fleet is lost. I think the other scene that I happened to nail was, now you will die. The Windows compatible line was, just because I was having troubles with Windows at the time. I also got sick of seeing Windows compatible on every computer box I own. I was like, well, it's not that compatible because half my stuff doesn't work with it. I love her reaction there. It looks like she really is scared. throwback to the earlier joke. Poof. Um, Original concept in the script actually was that the death bomb does work, and that some of the critics had these little sort of fighter ships. And the concept behind the death bomb, the reason it was called that, is the death bomb was going to fire bad movies at them, like CDs or something, or DVDs, and or broadcast bad movies over the speakers, and it was going to be like Batman and Robin and all these things, and that's why it was called the death bomb. It was launching bombs, which fit into the whole Hollywood thing. And we were going to have Fela shout, "It's a bunch of crap! Move away from the death bomb!" But I find it ironic that's the only thing we didn't do was the "it's a trap" meme. The most famous line from that movie now. It's one thing we avoided, but probably for the best. So yeah, I tinkered with the background, so I made this sort of smoke. Because now the plot hole's getting badass. Kind of wanted to give it like a sort of character. We based it on, there's a Futurama episode where Bender gets launched into space and meets God, sort of, what may be or may not be God, but it's sort of a galaxy that it kind of has this character by the way it talks and kind of moves a bit, and it works. So I was really conscious of color correcting it so that like when it gets pissed, the background turns red. Right now, when shit gets real, the background's this gray smoke, and early on it had this sense of wonder, so. This, man, this scene was difficult to write. Doug, we kind of tossed it back and forth to each other. What Doug did was he was like, here's what I want out of this scene. And then I kind of wrote a scene based on what he wanted, which about maybe half of it's retained. And then Doug's like, no, I don't think you're getting it. I'm like, Doug, I don't know what you want. Like, this is kind of weird. It's based on some idea he had back in high school. But he sent me sort of paragraphs. He's like, write something like this, only make it sound cooler. So I ended up doing that. So I had things like the House of Cards metaphor. Remove a card, the house, crumbles or whatever. Like, so I had a lot of things like that, like, to kind of give it this sort of Matrix-y effect. To me, it reminds me of the Matrix, when he meets the creator at the end of, I think it was the second film. God, Troken did a good job on the lightsaber effects. One of the drinking games in this game should be how many times I say good. I probably overplayed that way too much. Yeah, okay, that was my dig against YouTube. I don't like YouTube comments. They're so bad. Bruce Kidney disagrees with that. I think it works. Like, my goal was to kind of take the scenes in Star Wars but point out some of the little flaws. Like, I love the scene where he says, "I won't fight you, Father." I'm like, well, I'm pretty sure you're actually doing that, so... the scene where Brian says, "Ram a laser sword down his throat." That was another one where it's like, Luke says, I can't kill my own father. And, like, Obi-Wan's like, well, that's the only way. I guess the Emperor's won. And I'm like, really? Wow, Jedis are kind of douchebags. Like, it's like there's no sense of compassion or any other way. It's like, nah, just kill him. It was always one of my biggest gripes about Jedi, as much as I like it. I'm just like, I just love how callous Obi-Wan is. Just kill him. I love the Star Trek 2 or Star Trek 6 sequence. Had a lot of fun doing the effects for that. I did the sparks and the smoke here again. Even though they're not perfect and they have issues, they add a lot. I did know almost from the beginning that I think I wanted to do the blue shell. The blue... The blue shell joke was something that I'm just like, yes, yes, yes. Because I knew we were going to do... That was one of the most complex effects I had to do. I had to do all those sparks and explosions that match with the sounds. And the smoke moving away. I I knew because we were doing the Wii joke that we should have them fire red shells. I was like, well, the ultimate weapon, the torpedo they make, like the one in Star Trek 6 that can heat seek or whatever, should be a blue shell. Explosion was another complicated one. Um, and I made those blue shell plans at the last second. They're basically, I think they're architectural designs for Spaceship Earth, the Walt Disney ride. And just other just architectural plans I spliced together and then put the blue shell in the middle of it. And there's all sorts of little things written on it. Maybe we'll include it on the DVD, but just things to make it look like Etta designed it, references to her. Yeah, I love that. This is Doug's best acting, by the way. This whole sequence from here on out. He really sold it. I'm not entirely sure. I got some of the idea, but Doug definitely took whatever I wrote initially and then was rewriting it to match whatever it was he wanted, because I never quite fully understood it. I'm not entirely sure I still do, but, you know, Doug gets it and that's all that's important. You can argue it's like a 2001 thing. But we did know early on we always wanted to do like a breaking the fourth wall thing. So that was always there. But just what it all means, the whole choice thing, he was really huge on that. From the very beginning, he's like, I have this whole thing, it's about choice, it's about choice. It's going to be like that scene with the Joker. And he's just saying, and then Matisse is saying, here we go. And it's going to be like that. And I'm like, okay. And I was like, you do it, Doug. Because I'm like, I think you really have a vision of what you want. So he gave it to me. I wrote some of it. I sent it back to him. He then rewrote some of it. And then what he considered closer to his final draft, I then rewrote that to a small degree just to give some of the lines like more punch and stuff. So this chunk was a lot of Doug, and but it really worked. And I think the action scene was all Doug. I didn't have input in that, and the distraction scene was pretty much all Doug. I didn't have any input in that, and the rest was definitely collaborative. So I actually there actually where the action scene was a giant gap. And I just said, insert Doug action scene here. So he definitely wrote that. Yeah, now the color gets nasty. I'm kind of glad that we did this because it gives this scene a little bit more of an epic punch. I can't imagine if this was just black. You do see what it's like black at the very end, which I didn't really color correct because like or add anything because I'm like, I don't have anything here. And I think it works black, because there's nothing really going on, so. Goat barn? Really? I think the creepiest thing about this scene is how much this actually does look like Star Wars. It looks like that scene where Vader's wandering around trying to lure Luke out. I also hear that's another one of people's favorite lines, like, you can't hide, Luke, it's not that big of a room. At least amongst the producers anyway. I came up with the line actually because it wasn't that big of a room and I had to acknowledge it. So I was just like, you know what? I'm just going to have him say it. I had to think because we already did Uwe Boll, so I was trying to think of a director that, you know, because I was trying to spoof the Leia line. I was like, who could they turn the critic into that he'd be like, no! And I finally just stumbled upon Tommy Wiseau, and I was like, yeah, it has to be Tommy Wiseau. Rule the world as total corporate sellouts. Interesting thing about the music, I originally had this scene temp tracked with Mahler's, I think it was Mahler's second, it's the Resurrection Symphony or whatever. Doug liked it, but he's like, it's too loud, it's, you know, maybe too distracting, so he slowed it down. Cut it to pieces and slowed it down, and then added his voice over it, so it actually has that effect. And And I actually like it because I think you should actually have this epic effect. Like, you should actually care for Luke and Brad still. Like, even though this is a spoof and we're playing it up for yucks, like, their story arc does have a beginning, a middle, and an end, and their story arc should mean something. So like, you should feel that sort of epic impact of, like, oh my god. That was another dig at the Sith. My problem with the Sith is always they're killing their people off all the time. I'm like, how are these people ever going to remain in power? And why would you work for a Sith? Because he always seems to replace his assistants. Interesting thing about the music, Mike Machad's like, we're going to have to change the music. And I'm like, why? Well, you use that Star Wars music there. I'm like, where? Well, the handshake scene or whatever. He's like, I finally realized what he was talking about. I'm like, Mike, that's Wagner. I'm like, John Williams ripped that off of Wagner. He's like, oh, you mean that's not John Williams? I'm like, no, but it sounds an awful lot like it, doesn't it? He's like, yeah. I mean, it sounds exactly like the Force theme from Star Wars. But no, that's Wagner, so we could totally get away with it. But I wanted something that sounded like Star Wars there, and that really fit the bill. I had to ask Luke, can we reference your father? Because that was one of the earliest lines in the script when I knew we were going to kind of go the Jedi route. I'm like, at least with having Luke Mockery in it, I'm going to add it there. I added the lens flare here because the color correction was all really off. It was too dark on the left-hand screen, so it was trying to distract from that. I love Doug's reaction. I should say the one thing that really surprised me about this film is how dramatic the actors were and how surprising that was. Allison's a good example. When I wrote Allison's scene, like where she tries to convince Todd to help her, I wrote that as a snarky scene. I wrote it like she does in reviews. So there was this self-awareness that she was kind of playing Todd a little because she wanted to legitimately save the ship, but Todd was the only one who believed her. So it's like, all right, I'll play along, but you know, I really don't believe this. And she played it serious, almost as if maybe she was considering, like, please do this. Like, and the tone was completely different. It's not how I wrote it, but it was a huge surprise and like one of those great surprises. Like, wow, that is not how I envisioned that when I wrote it, but it really kind of works. Some surprises were, I mean, just Otaku. The Ed stuff worked, and I'm very happy, but I mourn the loss of losing her as a straight actor because she did that so well. This is another lens flare added to distract from the fact that the bridge is in the background and not blowing up. She did that scene where they're putting the pieces of where they're putting the two sketches together. So pitch perfect. Like, she really established mystery there and really sold that scene along with Ciara. And I'm like, man, I would kill to see what she could do with drama. Like, because she really nailed that scene. Film Brain has the toughest job of all. He has to not only play a character that we invented out of scratch, that was an idiot and a sycophant and a kiss-ass to Doug. He has to play this kiss-ass sycophant character that we already established, that was already way over the top, but play him dramatic. I think people who complain about Film Brain's acting are actually missing something. His acting's actually really good, because he has to take an idiot character and try to play that dramatic while still being sort of an idiot character that just has evolved a bit. He can't do this as a straight-up drama. He still has to be Film Brain, but he has to be Film Brain, the goof from the first two movies, acting dramatic. I'll be damned if I don't think he kind of pulled it off. Like, it's insanely difficult, and like he sells the sincerity as it goes on. So kudos to him. I mean, Brad, you don't even need to talk about. He just always gives his typical Brad Jones 100% performance. Spoonie is fantastic. Sage was another one. A lot of his like deadpan lines he delivers great. I mean, this stuff's funny too, but I particularly love it at the end when they're talking about how people can change, and Sage just delivers it fantastic. It manages to be just that slight amount of hokey because we have to wrap things up, but also really legit. You know, Linkara does his normal, you know, good job. Lindsay, I thought, was spectacular as 7 of 11, which is funny because she didn't want to do it, and initially it wasn't my idea because Doug wanted the love triangle, and he's like, she needs to get assimilated. Okay, well, that leaves only two options. There's not a lot of female robot characters, and if we're not making her that maid from the Jetsons, we're in trouble. So she hated that costume and complained about it so much, but I'm like, would you have rather been in Borg Queen makeup the entire time and sat 2 hours next to Linkara getting your makeup done? That's what would have happened, because that's the only other option we had. I mean, the other option is not to have her assimilated at all, which I would have been okay with. I didn't want the love triangle. But since Doug was so sold on the love triangle, I'm like, well, that's the only female robot character I can think of, was Seven of Nine. So, and I felt bad for her. I'm sorry she hated it, but it was either that or 2 hours of makeup every day. Like, I couldn't think of anything else to get out of it. Dental plan. I had a lot of fun doing those little spark things. I actually didn't design them. I think that was Jim did that, but I had a lot of fun just acting there. I think my thing about the satire part of it, people are like, no, it's too close, it's too close. I don't think scenes like this work if we aren't that close, if we don't quote it verbatim and set up the fake seriousness, the sort of drunk on its own importance aspect of, quoting these things really seriously and doing it really seriously. Scenes like that don't work. It's about breaking down that fake seriousness and being goofy after that. I think scenes like, I told you to get an Egg McMuffin don't work if we're not establishing how really imperial he really is and really serious the dialogue is, how close to Star Wars is. That's what kind of makes lines like that funny. But Mecha was another one. Doug shot the ending scene to Mecha with Mecha in Suburban Nights without telling me. And then when I was starting the script, I saw the ending to Suburban Nights and pretty much just banged my head against a keyboard, because I'm like, you realize you've now pigeonholed us into having Mecha in this and having the Power Glove in this, and we have no plot for this. Like, I didn't know what to do, and Doug was like, well, we'll make it part of the love triangle and this and that, but it still bothers me to some degree because we never fully used Mecha. He was always sort of a MacGuffin, like. And the Power Glove, the biggest MacGuffin is the Power Glove. It's a McGluffin, a McGlovin. This is totally based on Sulu saving the day in Star Trek VI. But we never gave him quite a reason to be there. That's actually one of my favorite effects, is Mars Girl and the smoke clearing. He just didn't have much of a plot, and that's because we couldn't incorporate him. Like, we couldn't write. It was not going to be the Mecha movie. So it's like we knew what villains we wanted to do this, and somehow that's my second favorite effect. Fire. I don't know. It's just, I tried my best. I came up with the idea of him swallowing the thermal detonator, of him blowing up, of him trying to find the Power Glove. But the one thing about this scene that got cut is originally the Power Glove did have a purpose. I wrote it in there. Good Lord. It's me after slapping fake Bernie makeup on. I wrote it in there that Jew Wario uses the Power Glove that was dropped to steer the blue shell into the house. Which was going to be a cool moment for Jew Wario as well, but Doug thought it was too confusing, so the Power Glove really does have no purpose. And pretty much the whole plot around Mecha that is my only criticism, is the love triangle Mecha part of the plot. If you cut that from the movie, you would lose scenes with producers, which is not what we want. But from a storytelling perspective, you would lose nothing. It just doesn't serve the plot from beginning to end. That was the one thing I did write down, like in my notes, is like, always serve the plot. Every scene should serve the plot. And it is a rather long detour. The dream sequence stuff does. because the plot hole wraps up. And it serves the plot in as much as Mechakara is an agent for destroying the Death Bomb, which I desperately was desperate for ways to have something happen where he could be responsible for their demise, just to make him have a point. But it still, there are other ways we could have done that. We didn't need to have Mechakara there, so it's I don't know. Also gave us the disadvantage of it means Linkara's not in it that much either. It's just Mechakara, so this is probably the least Linkara heavy movie overall. Well, no, I take it back. Suburban Nights. I think kind of like his only story arc was he wants to sing a song. So yeah, that was one of the few things that just didn't doesn't work as a whole. But as I said, I view it as a mini-series, so it works, I think, as a mini-series. Yes, it's a long detour, but if you look at it as, we have the time to do this, this is a mini-series, this is not meant to be looked like as a movie, I think it works. Because you can take your times with things like that, and you can go on detours and mini-series, and so I do think it works, but I did get that a lot on my own Facebook public page. It's like, well, what was the point of it? I'm like, the Mecha Car Plant, where'd the Power Glove go? Well, why didn't he just do this? So. I like this scene. Though it always makes me laugh because the music's so triumphant. It's like, after all of this, what do we cut to? It's paradise. It's suburbia! The brilliance of this scene, which this was Doug's idea. I did not come up with this. The brilliance of it is it also ties together the ankle bracelet thing, because he's able to look where he would have had the ankle bracelet, and it's not there anymore, so it actually bookends that quite nicely. And it also basically wraps up a couple other points, which is he's been trapped in this house the whole time, and now he has a chance to leave, both metaphorically and physically. And yet he chooses not to. I love Doug's look there. He's just like, I don't know what's going to happen, but... Doug was so obsessed with it. He's like, I want it exactly like this. And he got it, so... He's always like, I want him saying, here we go. I really wish we could have done a better impression of Mati, but... You can only go with what you got. Mati's never been my best impression, so... it's honestly, the Mati voices is Doug and I at different times. It just depends. Some sentences literally start off me, then switching to Doug, then Doug switching to me. He edited it together, so... But I got a weird statement in the comments section about people. There was somebody who was just like, I can't believe that Doug would overdub your voice, Rob. That's so rude. And he never did that once. I don't know where that's coming from. He did, however, overdub Brad once. The scene where Brad says, oh shit, when Luke comes in and attacks him, that's actually Doug. Because we ran out of time. It was a last minute addition the day before the release of that, so... Honestly, I don't think you can really tell. This is another scene that I wrote that was very important. Doug basically made it a little more critic-like in the delivery of the dialogue, but most of it's unchanged. That was one thing I had a discussion with Doug, and I'm like, great acting out of bed in here. I had a discussion with Doug. I'm like, I think what it should be, the big moment is the critic apologizes. I think that's all Mati was looking for, and that it's the biggest thing the critic has never done. The critic has never apologized. He always does these awful things, and after every movie, comes up with another scheme or faces no true consequences. So for me, the entire story arc of the movie is based around getting the critic to realize that he did something wrong and needed to apologize to Mati and tell Mati that, you know, he does appreciate him. Like, you know, it's time to move on. And this is part of that whole thing from the original. It was really about a battle for Mati's soul. Like, Mati was convinced that, you know, everybody hated him and, you know, it's very... I'm not going to lie. I think in some respects it reminds me of that damn Care Bears movie where it comes down not to a bunch of violence, but to couple people talking to somebody who's gotten burned, you know. But I've always actually made the argument that for a film aimed at 4-year-olds, the Care Bears movie was actually strangely good because violence doesn't solve the answer. And in this case, violence doesn't solve the answer with the plot hole. It's what I respect about Return of the Jedi. The best thing about that movie is that Luke throws the lightsaber away. You know, it's about, you know, violence not always being the answer, so... And in this case, the plot hole is the biggest threat, and basically trying to take it on directly is not how you solve it. This scene is, I would say it's loosely based on Star Trek 2, where they're trying to get away from the Genesis torpedo from exploding. I started color correcting things here to make them blue, and honestly, my favorite color correction is in this room when I add the blue to it. Really pops and looks good. This is definitely a little more washed down, a little more green. The funny thing is, I did not color correct any of the stuff when Doug was in reality before that. Before the plot hole starts exploding, that was all... It was color corrected just a little bit, but like that was all mostly what Doug shot, because he shot it beautifully. So I don't think we even did that. I don't think we even used any of the Mojo colorista stuff on it. Yes, the big reveal. So in the original draft, the nerd actually was going to play the Sarek role and come in and defend the critic early on against Turl. That thing got changed to Brian, and the nerd got bumped to here. And my only concern was, aren't people going to figure this out right away? I mean, they're going to know. We always do this with the nerd. Why don't we just bring the nerd in early? It'll be a little more fun that way. He has a bigger role, you know, beginning and end. And it's like, no. But Doug came up with the brilliant out. He had that line. He was just like, oh, I think everybody figured it out already. And he had that in well before the film was released. That was always in there from the beginning. And I was like, wow, Doug, you must have been psychic, because everybody did predict it. And that made that line so much funnier. So this is Nash's cameo. That it was supposed to be a larger role originally, unfortunately, but well, unfortunately it got cut. Not unfortunately, it was supposed to be larger, but I kind of looked at Nash as like he's got this Mr. Universe-like quality. Like he can just dial the universe as he needs to. It's his special power. This goes back pretty much, I think, to the earliest concept of the film when I was coming up with it. I said the only way to defeat it originally was going to be get a bunch of douchey McNitpicks to defeat it, and then I realized it still wasn't making any sense. Still, how do we kill the critic and this and that? And then I had this idea, make it bigger. Because the science behind the plot hole, I kind of thought about it for a while, how the whole science of it works, and it's that so long as the plot hole is inside the universe, whenever it interacts with reality, those edges, those big-lipped alligator moments that go flying out, that's where you're going to have the main problem. But if you grow it to such a point that it swallows the universe whole so that the entire universe is the plot hole, then you basically just accept whatever reality is tossed at you. So nobody would notice the big-lipped alligator moments. They would just happen because this is reality now. But as it stands originally, they would notice some plot holes, but then maybe not notice others. Like this idea is that it was ripping holes in reality. But now reality is the hole, so it's not a problem. So the only way to do this is to just, how do you make plot holes grow? Well, bring up more plot holes, you know? Just have the thing grow to such a huge, huge size. That was a throwback to the Bjork show, one of the first things we did before Channel Awesome even started. It was my friend Victoria. And then Doug... Okay, I wish we could say we were smart enough to point that out, or to have that planned about the bum pointing out the hole earlier with the beaming, but no, we kind of read that on the comments page, and Doug had already pointed out beforehand and said, let's see if anyone notices, and we just decided, you know what, we'll just we'll have the bum. That'll be the bum cameo. We'll shoot at the last second. I think it was the last thing shot. This scene, I was working on the music forever. Um, Jim added this sort of Superman-esque 70s glow, which is what I wanted because it's supposed to be getting closer. I started adding lens flares to basically beef up sort of the glowy quality of it, but I really was going for, and I told Doug this because Doug actually wanted this scene cut, and this is the biggest one I had the argument over, and that one got testy, and I'm like, no, no fucking way, this scene stays. His argument that he was like, well, people just want to get back to the critic. We got to get back to the critic again. I'm like, well, it's not just about the critic. This is their swan song as well. We don't know if we're doing this again. Let them have this moment, this sort of like sort of chit-chatting as they know the end is inevitable. I based it kind of on the opening to the new Trek film, when Kirk, older Kirk, is talking to his wife about the birth of their son, and there was a way it was done that was just so brilliant, of just talking even though you're facing the inevitable end. There was another movie too. I think it was called The Great Train Robbery, and the two main characters, I think it was Fess Parker and someone else. It was a Disney movie, and I always remembered it as a kid because it had a dark ending, and it's the two of them just chit chatting as they're chained together on a train, knowing they're going to be hung. But there was something very poignant about it. They were just kind of singing and chit chatting and knowing it was the end. It was like I wanted to go for that. Just like this idea that they know it's over, but you know what? Let's just enjoy the moment and get a little nostalgic. Doug sold this scene so well. He got exactly what I wanted. It was another line. He wanted this line cut. He's like, oh, we've done enough spoofs. And I'm like, no, because it is such a perfect critic line, First off, you should be upset because you've just killed your producers. And now you're feeling guilt for things, but the biggest thing, it is so in the critic's nature to be like, to have the nerd say, what you always do, turn death into yet another excuse to blow shit up, because that's all the critic does. Again, for all the Ghostbusters references people complain about, nobody ever noticed that this is a Ghostbusters reference. See you on the other side. Nice working with you. But yeah, so I found this piece of music, and I think it's Mahler's second, it's whatever that Resurrection chorus is. And like, I threw it in there and said, I don't know, Doug, maybe this. And Doug was like in love with it. He's like, oh my God. He just kept playing it again and again. And he's like, I love this. I love this. And it gave the scene such an epic quality and this swan song-like quality of like, our brave heroes going to meet their end. It was kind of like Return of the King-ish. It just like, Last Stand, Alamo sort of. And it gave it just this spiritual quality too, because I mean they're pretty much dying, and they all acted that scene so well. Particularly the poses everyone has as they know they're going in, and then of course it's delightfully ruined in a great way before the Boffins line turns into another dumbbell scene. But yeah, that I think actually that and the Flight of the Navigator scene and the scene where Owen is basically instructing Luke, the film montage, are like my favorite scenes in the movie. But the critics in particular meeting their end. I don't know, it makes me kind of misty-eyed, and that's when I was like, you know what? I don't care what people say. We may have made a cheesy movie, but you know what? I had an emotion there, so there you go. Like, if it kind of just makes me a little like nostalgic, like, oh man, like, kind of affects you, then hopefully like we did our job. Again, take it seriously. It's not. Yes, it's just a silly movie, but you have to take it seriously as you're making it. So. And we're not making Citizen Kane here. I don't for a second think this movie's good in the classic sense. Like, it's still a bunch of us goofing around, but. Oh, this scene. Okay, so. Doug had this alternate ending where he wanted Santa Christ to do all of the exposition. I always wanted it to be Insano, because I'm like, no, it's kind of like Back to the Future 3, and it bookends it. Insano gave the plot exposition earlier. He should be the one to end it. It's funnier coming out of Insano. Doug would not have any of it and decided that as the sun's going down, because these shots with all the group is when the sun's going down, as the sun's going down, after that, he was going to shoot the Santa Christ bits first and then the Insano bits. Well, we ran out of light because he was shooting the scenes we didn't need, which were the Santa Christ bits. He decides, we'll do the Insano stuff the next day. He shoots the Insano stuff next day because of the way everything was scheduled in the morning. So the Insano stuff, which he eventually decides to use because it's better, is a bright blue sunny morning set against the group shots, which are this dark yellow sunset. And people are wondering, is this the plot hole? What's with the color correction? I was like, the only reason this is done is because it is so obviously a bright blue cloudless morning in the other shots, and it is so obviously dusk here that it was insanely distracting. Like, it made no sense. If it was all glorious blue sky and everything in green, I would have loved it, but I'm just like, this is obviously dusk, and we never make a joke about it. Well, it's because of the plot hole, so I'm like, that doesn't even work. I'm just like, you know what, we may just color correct the whole thing and just turn it into one big dusk, even if it doesn't look quite right, but... So yeah, that's why this whole scene looks like this. Now, interesting to hear, this was a holdover from the original script. In the original script, he was supposed to go to it was like North Jerusalem, and we were going to do a scene where because we were going to have Bargo. And we do this scene where Bargo, it was Mati's body and Spoonie's body next to each other, and as Santa Christ, I was going to put my hands over both their foreheads and basically bring them back to life in a montage. But yeah, we managed to do the search for Spock without actually having Spock come back. And it's funny because I know that's what Nicholas Myers wanted to do originally. He always talked about, in my world, people don't come back from the dead. So, yeah, it would have been interesting to see Star Trek 3 like that, where Kirk has to actually go on this adventure and then find out that he has to actually really accept death for what it is. But I guess they got around that by killing his son, but then he gets his best friend back, so it's a bit of a cop-out, but whatever. Speaking of death, some people didn't realize that Spoonie had died. He actually, in the original script was actually darker, as Spoonie said, whoa, heavy, but they can't get out of the plot hole unless Spoonie, the connection is shut off. So Spoonie, in his dream mind, actually shot himself. The idea being, you kill yourself in the dream, you kill yourself in real life. And then that allows the two of them to escape out of the device. And I was fine with it because I was, well, he comes back. So, but some of the lines got cut. There was supposed to be a scene where when they come out and he says, we're not going to make it or whatever, somebody asked what happened to Spoonie, and Sage was supposed to give this look and shake his head like, no. So it was supposed to be implied that he was dead, and in the original script, the critic's final gift, there was another scene cut where the critic talks to Mati in the hole right before he disappears at last, and it's just these two sort of orbs of light. And he says, I guess that's it, critic. I guess you're done. And he says, no, I have one thing left to do. And it was implying that he was bringing Spoonie back, that part of the reason he also joined with the Hole was because otherwise you couldn't really bring Spoonie back. You didn't have, the Hole suck them in, well, I guess you wouldn't have anybody, so, but Spoonie would have died before that, so that's what the script was implying. So, I don't know, it got jumbled because, again, things got changed, but Doug was concerned about this ending because he's just like, she played it so well that maybe she liked Todd and they hold hands together and now we just completely reverse it. Is that going to make her look like a bitch? And it's kind of, I don't know, it's kind of funny. It's like, it's like Speed, you do things basically in the moment when you think you're going to die, but now that she's sobered up out of the, horror of the moment, she's like, oh, hey, Phaelus. I think this may have been slight of an in-joke, because I think Nash is the one who actually doesn't like Ed, which again led to a lot of my confusion over that. Her comic timing was so brilliant. I mean, I'd kill to see her do drama, but I will say this, she's got fantastic comic timing. This was another change scene. I had it where Lindsay was contemplating running for president to try to stick it to the man more, but she didn't like that and apparently would prefer Joe to call her a bitch, so guess whatever floats your boat. Um, this was pretty unchanged, and I think Holly suggested snorting the coke or whatever. I really love this ending. It's the perfect amount of nostalgia, moving on. It's everybody's kind of having fun. They're partying. We always knew we were going to do the ghosts here. Originally, we were going to have just a Yoda puppet. And then we were going to switch it to Kyle, but Kyle's in the background. So then Doug brought up the good point. Well, the problem with green screen is it's green, and the problem with Yoda is he's green. So we just came up with this idea at the last second. I think it was Jim Trokin that suggested just throw Hayden Christensen in there. There was some debate, too, about whether it should be Film Brain or Sage. Or no, whether it was supposed to be Luke or Sage that grabs Film Brain, because originally Luke and Film Brain had that connection with the conversation, but Sage also had that moment inside the plot hole, so we decided to go with him. That stupid still shot with the petrified cat that doesn't move. Other funny thing, I wanted a group shot really bad. They did that in Return of the Jedi, and I liked it. It just felt good. It felt right. Get everybody together, lined up in a row, and kind of having fun. Of all people, Linkara was the one who was just like, why are we lining up? Nobody did that in Return of the Jedi, and I was like, okay, turn in your geek card now, because that is totally how Return of the Jedi ended, so... yeah, I'm trying... Oh, and Sci-Fi Guy brought back... A lot of people thought he really was dead, and I was like, no, we killed off Brian, but I always felt Brian could be sent back because the critic could kick him out of the hole if he wanted to, and Sci-Fi Guy was always going to come back. So, special thanks to Jim. That is the thing about this film, so many people saved it at different times. It wouldn't have gotten done otherwise. Jim was a big one. He did that color correction at the last section, which saved so much of the look of the film. Holly was another big one. We would not have finished on time without her. She was able to get us back on track when she got over her surgery. She had her gallbladder out before that. But she was able to come in the middle of it, and I'm convinced it would not have gotten done, because we went so far over anyway, and that was before we instituted the things that she had suggested to get the shoot back on schedule. So... Doug, because quite frankly there were mistakes, but we still asked him to do a film in 6 days and he did it spectacularly. All things considered, like, he had the energy and he had the drive to do it, and again, it's like it wouldn't have gotten done otherwise. Yes, we had to really push our producers hard, and that's the next group of people need to be thanked. The producers and the actors went above and beyond. Brad, Luke, and I in the 100-degree room, Ed Glazer and Jim J. Roz filming are the We Shot First guys, doing all of the camera work and lighting and makeup. And the actors themselves, like, many nights were spent up till 2 in the morning, and, Brad, Luke, and I were up till 4 in the morning on the final night. They did it, and I know it sucked for you guys, but I'm so grateful because we were able to actually get this movie done. And again, my apologies, our mistake for thinking we could have done it faster because there were no outdoor shots. We got lulled into a false sense of security. But Jillian, who was an immense help, she stayed up late correcting the script with me, and she was a huge assistance to Holly. Tried to do some of the choreography, but we ran out of time on that, unfortunately. But she was there beginning to end, just always assisting us. Ed, obviously, just fantastic cinematography, and the We Shot First guys who... provided the makeup, the lighting, extra cameras, a special dolly they built for us to use. In Jim Trokin's team, who did such a good job on the effects, the modelers, the texture artists, the animators. I was blown away, so couldn't be more grateful. I guess to wrap up, first off, to the many Bothans who died. I don't know. I had a lot of fun doing this. Writing the script was hell. A lot of the Sopa stuff ended up in there because... God, are we nuts. This was an alternate ending that we decided to put. We thought it would be fun to close out the NC and kind of break the fourth wall a bit. It's based on some truth too, because I got legitimately nostalgic and was just talking to Doug. I was like, "What are we gonna do every Wednesday now? We always would watch a bad movie," and Doug just simply said, "Why don't we watch a good movie?" So, also kind of reminds me of the Truman Show closer, but I was like, "That's a very good point, Doug." And our battle over the writing credit continues to the very end. But this was my first huge project. I didn't write Suburban Nights or Kick-Assia. Really, I came in and ghost wrote sections after it was all written, but this is the first one I did beginning to end, and then had Doug come in and make corrections. My favorite part is the first part of the movie still, and I do think the film has problems, I'm not going to lie, and we're not perfect, but the second part gets a little draggy and weird, but my second favorite part of the movie is the third part, mostly because I think Doug and I worked really well together. He had a vision, he wrote chunks of it, particularly the fourth wall stuff, and I ended up correcting some of it, just, making it all kind of, making the dialogue kind of flow a bit, but the collaboration we did, I think, on the third part in particular was my favorite working experience with Doug, despite all the arguments. We really worked well, and I had a spectacular time. So, I mean, if you liked it, you're welcome. If you didn't like it, sorry. I write a little different than Doug, that's all I can say. Things I do differently, some things I wouldn't, but I think overall it turned out good, and I just wanted to thank Doug for having the vision to do this, and I'm going to miss the critic, but it's been a blast. It's been a great 4 years, and thank you guys for watching, and sorry this whole thing was really rambly. I had a giant cup of coffee to get me through these 4 hours, so I'm a little ADD at the moment, but it was all in good fun.